My name is Alyssa, 34 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful cybersecurity consultant, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last week, my mother scoffed, shoving my $5,000 server into a cardboard box, while my VIP clients watched in horror. She claimed my sister needed it for a campaign office. That was the night I stopped changing my locks and decided to change my address instead. I left them a fully furnished apartment, an empty decoy safe, and a brand new tenant, a federal prosecutor with zero tolerance for burglary. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling suburban home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood was spent watching my parents, Thomas and Brenda, cater to every whim of my younger sister, Brittany. While I was building my own tech firm from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks to secure my future, they were busy funding Brittany's lavish lifestyle and her marriage to Jamal. Jamal is an African-American luxury real estate broker who recently decided he wanted to be a city councilman. He is obsessed with his public image, and my parents treat him like royalty. To them, my lucrative career in tech was just a hobby because I was unmarried. They viewed my success as nothing more than a convenient resource pool for Brittany and Jamal to dip into whenever they pleased. The clinking of crystal wine glasses in my dining room was abruptly shattered by the harsh scrape of a key turning in my front door. I was mid-sentence finalizing a multi-million-dollar data protection contract with 3 top-tier corporate executives. I had spent 6 grueling months securing this dinner meeting. I had hired a private chef, curated a flawless menu, and transformed my luxury apartment into a high-end professional sanctuary. The atmosphere was perfect. The clients were nodding in agreement, and the contract was sitting on the table waiting for signatures. That was when the heavy oak door swung open, hitting the entryway wall with a loud, aggressive thud. My parents barged in, unannounced. They did not even knock. They did not care that I had guests, nor did they care that it was 8 o'clock on a Thursday night. Brenda immediately walked into the dining area and wrinkled her nose at the catered truffle risotto sitting on the table. She loudly complained that the expensive dish smelled like wet dirt and old leaves, completely ignoring the shocked, frozen expressions on my clients' faces. I stood up instantly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, desperately trying to maintain a professional smile. Before I could even ask what they were doing in my home, Thomas marched straight past the dining room and headed directly for my home office. I quickly excused myself and hurried down the hall after him. I found my father aggressively yanking cables out of the wall. He was unplugging my primary server monitor, a highly customized, expensive piece of hardware I used for advanced penetration testing. I grabbed his arm, whispering frantically for him to stop and demanding to know what he thought he was doing. He shoved my hand away with brutal indifference. He grunted that Brittany and Jamal needed the monitor for the new campaign headquarters downtown. He looked at me with absolute disgust, stating that I was just a single girl typing in her pajamas all day, and I absolutely did not need 2 screens. The absolute humiliation burned my throat. I could hear my clients shifting uncomfortably in their chairs in the dining room. This was not just a simple boundary violation. This was a calculated, deliberate public execution of my professional credibility. They wanted to remind me that no matter how successful I was, no matter how much money I made, I still belonged to them, and they could take whatever they wanted. I stood in the doorway blocking his exit and told him firmly to put the monitor down immediately or I would call the police. Brenda walked up behind me and laughed loudly, making sure her shrill voice carried perfectly into the dining room. She told my clients not to mind me claiming I had always been their selfish problem child who refused to support her own family's endeavors. My lead client, a stoic and traditional CEO, slowly placed his linen napkin on the table and stood up. The meeting was completely ruined. I was forced to apologize profusely as I escorted my executives out the door and to the elevator, my professional reputation hanging by a thread. When I walked back inside, Thomas was standing in the living room holding the monitor under his arm. I pointed at the door and told them both to get out of my home. Thomas sneered at me, completely unfazed by my anger. He promised they would be back for the rest of the office equipment tomorrow because Jamal needed a dedicated server rack for his voter database, and they were not going to spend campaign funds on something I could just give them. As soon as I shoved them out into the hallway and the door clicked shut, my hands started shaking violently. I immediately called an emergency locksmith. I paid double the standard emergency rate to have a heavy-duty commercial-grade deadbolt installed that very night. I thought a physical barrier would solve the problem. I was completely wrong. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand. It was a text message from Brittany. It was not an apology for ruining my corporate dinner. It was a selfie. The photo showed Brittany and my father standing in my building's management office, holding up a brand new activated master keycard. The caption was dripping with venom and toxic entitlement. She wrote that she told the building management it was a family emergency and that I had accidentally lost my spare key. She cheerfully announced she would see me at noon to grab the monitor and that Jamal said thanks for the donation. The sheer audacity paralyzed me for a few seconds before a cold, calculated survival instinct finally kicked in. They were weaponizing the family emergency narrative. Jamal was a highly visible real estate broker in the city, known for his deep political connections and wealthy donors. The building management clearly bent their strict security protocols to appease a local political VIP and his seemingly distressed wife. My parents and my sister were completely convinced they owned my space, my belongings, and my peace of mind, simply because they felt entitled to my resources. They viewed my luxury apartment as nothing more than an extended storage unit for Jamal's political ambitions. I realized in that moment that changing the locks was nothing more than a temporary bandage on a fatal wound. If I fought them through the management office, Jamal would just use his influence and charm to make me look like an unhinged, uncooperative, and jealous sister. I needed to amputate the problem entirely. I needed a solution so permanent, so legally devastating, and so terrifying that they would never dare cross my threshold again. They did not know my biggest secret. I did not actually rent Unit 4B. Through a blind limited liability company that I had set up years ago, I actually owned the entire luxury building. I had purchased the property as a long-term investment, keeping my landlord status strictly confidential from everyone, especially my family. I had a stunning vacant penthouse on the top floor that had just finished a massive renovation. I looked around my beautifully decorated apartment, the place I had called home for 3 years. I decided right then that I was not just going to leave, I was going to leave a highly calibrated, inescapable trap. I grabbed my suitcases and rapidly packed my clothes, my highly sensitive hard drives, and my actual work laptops. I deliberately left my expensive velvet sofa, my large flat-screen television, and a heavy bolted-down mini-safe in the master bedroom to serve as decoy items. The safe was completely empty, but it looked incredibly important. Then I pulled up my contacts and dialed Kendra. I had met Kendra at a corporate legal seminar a few months prior. She was a fiercely intelligent federal prosecutor, a woman deeply feared in the courtroom, known for her icy demeanor and her absolute zero tolerance for any kind of criminal behavior. We had exchanged numbers when she casually mentioned looking for a secure short-term lease downtown while her own suburban house was undergoing extensive foundation repairs. Kendra answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. I kept my tone perfectly steady, matching her energy. I told her I had a fully furnished high-security luxury apartment available immediately, and I would give her the first 3 months, completely rent-free, if she could sign the paperwork and move in by tonight. Kendra did not ask any unnecessary questions about my sudden generosity. She recognized a fantastic deal when she heard one and simply asked me to text her the address and the door code. By 10 o'clock that morning, I had officially transferred the legal lease of Unit 4B to Kendra. Because of her sensitive government position, the lease was filed under her federal protection, alias ensuring maximum privacy and security. I hauled my bags up to the penthouse on the top floor and locked the heavy security door behind me. As part of Kendra's lease agreement, I had legally disclosed the presence of a security camera in the living room, which she had enthusiastically approved for her own safety, given the nature of her job. I connected the camera feed directly to my secure tablet. At 11:30, my phone chimed with another message from Brittany. It was a photo of her and Jamal at an elite political brunch wearing designer clothing and rubbing elbows with wealthy city officials. She texted that mom and dad were on their way to the apartment to clear out the rest of my office. She warned me not to be a stubborn brat and lock the door again, because Jamal really needed those desks to set up his phone banking station by the weekend. I did not reply. I simply muted her conversation. I sat on the plush leather sofa in my new penthouse, poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and pulled up the hidden camera feed on my tablet screen. The apartment below looked exactly as I had left it, peaceful, quiet, and filled with expensive bait. The trap was perfectly set, legally ironclad, and ready to snap shut. I smiled, took a slow sip of my coffee, and waited for my arrogant family to walk right into their own absolute destruction. At exactly 1:15 the next afternoon, the hallway camera feed on my tablet chimed with motion detection. I watched as Thomas and Brenda marched out of the elevator. They were pushing a heavy-duty moving dolly. Brenda was holding the fraudulently obtained keycard. She had a smug and triumphant smile plastered across her face. She swiped it and the light flashed green. They pushed the door open and stepped into the apartment. I switched my tablet to the interior camera feed I had legally disclosed in Kendra's lease agreement. This camera focused only on the entryway and living room. Brenda shrieked with delight, tossing her designer knockoff purse onto the kitchen counter. She shouted that I had left the good sofa. Thomas ignored the furniture. He made a beeline for the master bedroom. I watched the live feed as Brenda began rummaging through the entryway console table. Her eyes lit up when she found a velvet box. It was not mine. It was Kendra's vintage Cartier watch. Brenda slipped it directly into her pocket without a second thought. Meanwhile, the audio picked up Thomas grunting from the bedroom. He was loudly complaining about how heavy the mini safe was as he tried to pry it off the wall with a crowbar he had brought. They were so consumed by their own greed and so entirely confident in their entitlement that they did not hear the heavy and authoritative footsteps echoing down the hallway. The front door swung open. Kendra stepped in. She was dressed in a sharp and tailored suit flanked by two uniformed police officers she had been consulting with over lunch. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Brenda froze with her hand still hovering over Kendra's mail. Thomas stumbled out of the bedroom with the crowbar in hand, sweating profusely. He barked at Kendra, demanding to know who she was. He attempted to puff out his chest and asked if she was my new roommate, telling her they were taking the safe. Brenda chimed in, looking Kendra up and down with utter disdain. She stated that they were my parents and had every right to be there. She ordered Kendra to take her police escorts and get out before she called the manager to have them thrown out. Kendra did not blink. Her eyes locked onto the bulge in Brenda's pocket, the unmistakable shape of the Cartier box. Kendra dropped her voice to a dangerous and icy register. She announced that she was a federal prosecutor. This was her legally leased residence, and they were currently trespassing, holding a burglary tool, and concealing her stolen property. The color instantly drained from Thomas's face. The crowbar slipped from his hands and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Brenda shrieked that there had been a mistake. Her voice pitched into a hysterical frequency. She frantically dug into her pocket and tossed the velvet box onto the counter as if it were on fire. She yelled that her daughter lived there and had told them to come get her things. Kendra replied coldly that her lease agreement said otherwise. She nodded to the two officers and ordered them to arrest my parents for breaking and entering possession of burglary tools and grand larceny. Thomas bellowed in protest, as one of the officers grabbed his arms and twisted them behind his back to snap the handcuffs shut. He screamed, asking if they knew who his son-in-law was. He shouted that Jamal was running for city council and would have their badges for this. The officers ignored him entirely and began reading them their Miranda rights. Brenda began hyperventilating, her mascara running down her cheeks. I watched the entire feed from my penthouse, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and pure vindication. They were shoved out into the hallway with neighbors peeking out of their doors to watch the chaotic perp walk. Just as they were loaded into the elevator, my phone started ringing. It was the local police precinct. I let it ring 3 times before I hit accept, making sure my voice sounded perfectly and innocently confused. Thomas's voice roared through the receiver, echoing with the metallic acoustics of a holding cell. He demanded I get down there right now and tell these idiot cops that they had permission to be in my apartment because they were trying to book them for felonies. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked out at the city skyline. I told him I did not know what he was talking about. I stated I was at home right now and nobody was there. Brenda snatched the phone, sobbing loudly into the speaker. She screamed that they were at the precinct because they went to get Brittany safe and some psychotic woman had them arrested. She demanded I come down there, pay their bail, and drop the charges immediately, or Jamal's campaign would be ruined. I dropped the confused act and let the ice seep into my words. I told her I moved out 2 days ago and did not live in that unit anymore. I clarified that the woman they just robbed was not a roommate, but a federal prosecutor. I informed them I could not drop charges on a crime committed against someone else. The dead silence on the other end of the line was absolute music to my ears. Brenda whispered in horror, asking if I had actually moved. I wished them good luck with their arraignment and hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with Jamal's caller ID. I answered to the sound of him hyperventilating. His voice vibrated with suppressed rage as he hissed, asking what the hell I had done. He said his campaign manager just got a tip that his in-laws were sitting in a federal holding cell and the press was going to be all over this. I asked him what he expected me to do since they broke into a stranger's apartment and stole jewelry. He barked that he expected me to handle my family. He claimed Brittany was having a panic attack in the bathroom. He stated he was hosting a $10,000 a plate fundraiser tomorrow night, and if this leaked, his donors would pull out. He ordered me to call that prosecutor, pay her off, and fix this, or he swore to ruin my career. I recorded the entire call. I sweetly asked Jamal if he was attempting to extort a witness in a federal case. He cursed loudly and slammed the phone down. He thought his political weight could bully me into submission. He did not realize that in the digital age, a cybersecurity consultant holds all the cards. I did not need to ruin his career. He was about to do it himself. By 6 in the morning the following day, the story broke. I had not even needed to leak it because Kendra's high-profile status meant the arrest logs were heavily monitored by local crime reporters. My phone pinged with a news alert. The headline was devastating, announcing a city council candidate's in-laws were arrested in a brazen daytime burglary of a federal prosecutor's home. The article included a highly unflattering mugshot of Thomas looking disheveled and Brenda with mascara smeared under her eyes. The fallout was instantaneous. My sister Brittany sent me a string of 20 unhinged text messages accusing me of setting a trap and destroying her life. She claimed her country club friends were already icing her out. Jamal's political donors, terrified of being associated with a federal crime, began freezing their campaign contributions. The news vans were camped outside Jamal and Brittany's pristine suburban home, effectively trapping them inside. Instead of taking accountability, Jamal's PR team issued a hasty and poorly worded press release. They claimed that Thomas and Brenda were suffering from age-related confusion and had accidentally entered the wrong apartment. It was a pathetic and transparent lie. And it was exactly the opening I was waiting for. Desperate to control the narrative, Brittany went on a popular local morning radio show. I listened to the broadcast from my penthouse taking notes. She crooned into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake and tearful sympathy. She claimed I had always struggled with severe mental instability and was deeply jealous of her husband's success. She told the host, I deliberately gave my elderly parents the wrong address and orchestrated this entire misunderstanding to humiliate them. She called me a deeply sick person. She was doubling down on the gaslighting, weaponizing my non-existent mental health issues to save her husband's doomed campaign. She painted Thomas and Brenda as frail and innocent victims who were tricked into wandering into a stranger's home. The radio host ate up, offering prayers for her family. My jaw clenched. They had pushed the boundary from entitlement to outright public defamation. Brittany thought she could spin a web of lies because she assumed there were no witnesses. She forgot who she was dealing with. I did not just have a witness. I had high-definition footage with crystal-clear audio. I did not send the video to the radio station because that would be too messy. Instead, using a heavily encrypted and untraceable email server, I sent the entire hallway and interior video files directly to Jamal's primary political opponent. 2 hours later, the video was plastered across every major news network in the state. The public watched in high definition as frail and confused. Thomas wielded a crowbar. They watched innocent Brenda shove a stolen Cartier watch into her pocket while bragging about using my apartment as a personal storage unit. The internet exploded. The mental instability narrative Brittany had peddled that very morning was completely obliterated. The footage proved undeniable and malicious intent. Jamal's campaign went into a total tailspin. Within an hour of the video leaking, Jamal called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall. Looking directly into the cameras and sweating under the flashing lights, Jamal threw my parents directly under the bus. He stated he was appalled and disgusted by the criminal actions of his in-laws. His voice shook as he announced he had officially severed all ties with Thomas and Brenda, claiming their actions did not reflect his family's values. The front door swung inward with a forceful push, hitting the rubber stop with a loud smack. Kendra stepped over the threshold, her presence instantly commanding the room. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her expression carved from absolute ice. Right behind her were two uniformed police officers, hands resting casually near their utility belts. The sudden noise startled Brenda so badly she dropped the mail she had just picked up. Thomas stumbled out of the master bedroom, wiping sweat from his forehead. He froze when he saw the uniforms, but his arrogant conditioning ran deep. He immediately puffed out his chest, gripping the crowbar tightly in his right hand. He glared at Kendra, demanding to know who the hell she was and how she got into his daughter's apartment. He barked that if she was my new roommate, she needed to pack her bags because they were taking the safe and selling the furniture. Brenda recovered her shock and immediately joined the offensive. She looked Kendra up and down with obvious disdain, sneering at her professional attire. Brenda confidently stated that they were my parents, which gave them every right to be there. She pointed a manicured finger at the door, ordering Kendra and her police escorts to leave the premises immediately before she called the building manager to have them forcibly removed. Kendra did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply let her eyes drift downward, locking on to the unmistakable rectangular bulge in the pocket of Brenda's designer cardigan. Kendra's voice dropped to a dangerous freezing register that echoed through the silent apartment. She announced that she was a federal prosecutor, this was her legally leased private residence, and they were currently trespassing, holding a burglary tool, and concealing her stolen property. The atmospheric shift in the room was instantaneous and brutal. The color completely drained from Thomas's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His fingers went slack. The heavy steel crowbar slipped from his grasp, crashing against the expensive hardwood floor with a deafening clang. Brenda let out a high-pitched shriek, her voice breaking into a hysterical frequency. She yelled that there had been a massive mistake. She frantically dug her hand into her pocket, pulling out the velvet Cartier box and tossing it onto the kitchen counter as if it were burning her skin. She sobbed, pointing frantically around the room, screaming that her daughter Alyssa lived there. She swore I had given them explicit permission to come and collect my belongings for Jamal's political campaign. Kendra looked at the velvet box on the counter, then back at Brenda. She coldly replied that her legally binding lease agreement said otherwise. Kendra turned her head slightly and nodded to the two officers. She instructed them to arrest the intruders for breaking and entering possession of burglary tools and grand larceny. The officers moved with practiced efficiency. One grabbed Thomas by the arms, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the wall. Thomas bellowed in protest, his voice cracking with sheer panic as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. He thrashed against the officer's grip, screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know if they realized who his son-in-law was. He roared that Jamal was a highly influential real estate broker running for city council, and Jamal would personally see to it that these officers lost their badges by morning. The officers completely ignored his threats. They began reciting their Miranda rights in a calm, monotonous drone that cut through the chaos. Brenda collapsed against the kitchen island, hyperventilating so hard she was gasping for air. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick black rivers. An officer gently but firmly pulled her hands behind her back and cuffed her. I watched the entire chaotic feed from the safety of my penthouse. My heart pounded against my ribs, fueled by a potent mixture of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated vindication. For 34 years, they had trampled over my boundaries, convinced their shared DNA granted them absolute immunity from consequences. Today, the bill had finally come due. The officers shoved my parents out into the hallway. Doors up and down the corridor cracked open as wealthy neighbors peeked out to watch the spectacle. Thomas and Brenda, who cared more about their social image than anything else in the world, were being paraded like common criminals. Just as the elevator doors slid shut behind them, my private cell phone started ringing. The caller ID displayed the local police precinct. I let it ring 3 times, taking a deep breath to steady my heart rate. I hit accept, making sure my vocal tone sounded perfectly calm and innocently confused. Thomas's voice exploded through the receiver. The metallic acoustics of the police transport van echoed in the background. He roared my name, demanding I get down to the station immediately. He ordered me to tell these idiot cops that they had explicit permission to be inside my apartment. He screamed that they were trying to book them for federal felonies. I walked over to my penthouse window, looking down at the tiny police cruisers pulling away from the building. I took a slow sip of my Cabernet. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I stated clearly that I was sitting at home right now and nobody was bothering me. Brenda snatched the phone from him. I could hear the rattling of her handcuffs against the receiver. She sobbed violently into the speaker, her voice hoarse from screaming. She wailed that they were at the precinct because they went to get Brittany's safe, and some psychotic woman had them ambushed and arrested. She demanded I come down there, pay their bail in full, and drop the charges immediately. She warned me that if this hit the papers, Jamal's political campaign would be permanently ruined and it would be entirely my fault. I dropped the confused act. I let the ice seep into my words, delivering the final blow. I told her I moved out of that apartment 2 days ago, and I did not live in that unit anymore. I clarified that the woman they just robbed was not a roommate but a federal prosecutor. I firmly stated that I could not drop charges on a crime committed against someone else. The dead silence on the other end of the line was absolute music to my ears. Brenda whispered in horror, her voice trembling as she asked if I had actually moved. I wished them the best of luck with their arraignment and disconnected the call. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID flashed with Jamal's name. I swiped to answer immediately, hitting the record button on my secondary device. I answered to the sound of Jamal hyperventilating, his polished political persona entirely shattered. He hissed my name, his voice vibrating with suppressed, terrifying rage. He asked what the hell I had done. He frantically explained that his campaign manager just received a tip from a precinct insider that his wealthy, upstanding in-laws were currently sitting in a federal holding cell. He panicked, stating that the local press was going to be swarming the station within the hour. I feigned mild surprise. I asked him what exactly he expected me to do, since they broke into a stranger's apartment in broad daylight and stole luxury jewelry. Jamal barked that he expected me to handle my family. He claimed Brittany was currently having a severe panic attack on their bathroom floor. He stated he was hosting a $10,000 a plate political fundraiser tomorrow night. He threatened that if this leaked, his most prominent donors would pull their funding immediately. He aggressively ordered me to call that prosecutor, pay her off with whatever amount she wanted, and fix this mess. He swore that if I did not handle it, he would use every political connection he had to ruin my career in the tech industry. I smiled at the recording device. I sweetly asked Jamal if he was attempting to extort a federal witness to cover up a felony. He cursed loudly and slammed the phone down. He thought his political weight could bully me into submission. He did not realize that in the digital age, a cybersecurity consultant holds all the cards. I did not need to ruin his career. He was about to do it all by himself. Brenda let out a high-pitched, breathless gasp, her hand frantically diving into her right pocket. She yanked the velvet Cartier box out and threw it onto the kitchen island like it was burning her fingers. She practically choked on her own spit as she tried to backpedal. She shrieked that there had been a terrible misunderstanding and that her daughter Alyssa lived here. She insisted I had given them explicit permission to come into the apartment and collect my belongings for Jamal's political campaign. Kendra stepped fully into the apartment, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not even look at the velvet box on the counter. She kept her piercing gaze locked entirely on Brenda. Kendra stated coldly that her legally binding, digitally signed lease agreement said otherwise. She calmly turned her head slightly and nodded to the two police officers standing at attention behind her. She instructed them to arrest the intruders for breaking and entering, possession of burglary tools, and grand larceny. The officers moved with practiced, terrifying efficiency. One officer immediately closed the distance between himself and my father. He grabbed Thomas by the upper arms, spinning him around forcefully and shoving him face first against the freshly painted hallway wall. Thomas bellowed in absolute protest, his voice cracking with sheer panic as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut heavily around his wrists. He thrashed against the officer's solid grip, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know if these cops realized exactly who his son-in-law was. He roared that Jamal was a highly influential luxury real estate broker currently running for city council, and Jamal would personally see to it that these officers lost their pensions by tomorrow morning. The officers completely ignored his desperate threats. They began reciting their Miranda rights in a calm, monotonous drone that violently cut through the chaos of the room. Brenda collapsed against the granite kitchen island, hyperventilating so hard she was physically gasping for air. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick black rivers, ruining her perfectly curated country club facade. The second officer gently but firmly pulled her manicured hands behind her back and cuffed her. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging them to call Jamal, swearing that he was a very important man who could clear this entire mess up with a single phone call. I sat comfortably in the living room of my penthouse, watching the entire chaotic feed play out on my secure tablet. My heart pounded against my ribs, fueled by a potent mixture of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated vindication. For 34 long years, they had trampled over my boundaries, firmly convinced that their shared DNA granted them absolute, unquestionable immunity from any real-world consequences. They believed my wealth and my success existed solely to be harvested for Brittany and Jamal. Today, the bill had finally come due, and the price was their precious public image. The officers roughly shoved my parents out into the hallway. Doors up and down the luxury corridor cracked open as wealthy, influential neighbors peeked out to watch the spectacle. Thomas and Brenda, who cared more about their social standing than anything else in the entire world, were being paraded like common, desperate criminals. The humiliation was absolute. Just as the elevator doors slid shut behind them, effectively sealing their fate, my private cell phone started ringing on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed the main dispatch number for the local police precinct. I let it ring 3 full times, taking a deep, steadying breath to regulate my heart rate. I swiped the screen to accept the call, making sure my vocal tones sounded perfectly calm and innocently confused. Thomas's voice exploded through the receiver. The harsh metallic acoustics of the police transport van echoed loudly in the background. He roared my name, demanding I get down to the police station immediately. He ordered me to tell these idiot cops that they had my explicit verbal permission to be inside my apartment. He screamed that they were actively trying to book them for federal felonies and that it would ruin the family name forever. I walked over to my expansive penthouse window, looking down at the busy city streets below. I watched the tiny police cruisers pull away from the front of my building, their red and blue lights flashing silently. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I stated clearly and firmly that I was sitting at home right now and nobody was bothering me. Brenda violently snatched the phone from him. I could clearly hear the metallic rattling of her handcuffs against the receiver. She sobbed violently into the speaker, her voice completely hoarse from screaming. She wailed that they were currently at the precinct because they went to get Brittany's safe, and some psychotic woman had them ambushed and arrested. She demanded I come down there right this second, pay their bail in full, and drop all the charges immediately. She aggressively warned me that if this hit the local papers, Jamal's political campaign would be permanently ruined, and it would be entirely my fault. I finally dropped the confused, innocent act. I let the absolute ice seep into my words, delivering the final crushing blow. I told her I moved out of that apartment 2 days ago, and I did not live in that unit anymore. I clarified that the woman they just robbed was not a temporary roommate, but a highly respected federal prosecutor. I firmly stated that I could not legally drop charges on a violent crime committed against someone else even if I wanted to. The dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line was absolute music to my ears. I could hear Brenda's jagged, terrified breathing. She whispered in absolute horror, her voice trembling violently, as she asked if I had actually moved without telling them. I smiled at my reflection in the window. I wished them the absolute best of luck with their arraignment hearing and disconnected the call. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID flashed with Jamal's name. I swiped the screen to answer, immediately hitting the record button on my secondary electronic device. I answered to the sound of Jamal hyperventilating, his usually polished, arrogant political persona entirely shattered. He hissed my name, his voice vibrating with suppressed, terrifying rage. He demanded to know what the hell I had done to his meticulously planned campaign. He frantically explained that his lead campaign manager just received an anonymous, urgent tip from a precinct insider that his wealthy, upstanding in-laws were currently sitting in a highly publicized federal holding cell. He panicked, his breathing shallow and rapid, stating that the local press was going to be swarming the police station within the hour. I feigned mild, polite surprise. I asked him what exactly he expected me to do, since my parents chose to break into a stranger's apartment in broad daylight and steal luxury jewelry. Jamal barked loudly that he expected me to handle my own family. He claimed Brittany was currently having a severe, uncontrollable panic attack on their master bathroom floor. He stated he was hosting a $10,000 a plate political fundraiser tomorrow night for the city's elite. He threatened that if this story leaked to the public, his most prominent financial donors would pull their funding immediately. He aggressively ordered me to call that prosecutor, pay her off with whatever amount of money she wanted, and fix this disastrous mess. He swore that if I did not handle it right now, he would use every single political connection he had to ruin my career in the tech industry forever. I smiled warmly at the glowing recording device sitting on my table. I sweetly asked Jamal if he was officially attempting to extort a federal witness in order to cover up a felony. He cursed loudly and slammed the phone down in a panic. He did not realize he was speeding toward his total public destruction. "Hello?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of groggy confusion into my voice, even though I was standing wide awake by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse looking out over the glittering city skyline. "Alyssa, you need to get down here right now," Thomas roared through the receiver. The harsh metallic acoustics of the police holding cell echoed loudly behind his voice, accompanied by the chaotic sounds of shouting officers and slamming iron doors. "Tell these idiot cops that we had permission to be in your apartment. They are trying to book us for federal felonies." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet, swirling the dark red liquid in the crystal glass. "Dad, what are you talking about? I am at home right now and nobody is here. Why are you at a police station?" "Stop playing games with us." Brenda snatched the phone from him. I could hear the heavy, unmistakable clink of steel handcuffs hitting the plastic receiver. She was sobbing violently, her voice entirely devoid of its usual country club polish. "We are at the downtown precinct. We went to your apartment to get Brittany safe like we told you we would, and some psychotic woman ambushed us and had us arrested. You need to come down here right this second, pay our bail in full, and drop these ridiculous charges immediately. If anyone sees us here, Jamal's political campaign will be completely ruined." "Mom," I said, dropping the confused act entirely and letting pure ice seep into my words. "I moved out of that apartment 2 days ago. I do not live in that unit anymore. And the woman you just robbed was not my roommate. She is a federal prosecutor. I cannot legally drop charges on a violent crime committed against a government official." The dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line was absolute music to my ears. I could hear Brenda taking shallow, ragged breaths as her brain desperately tried to process the information. "You moved," Brenda finally whispered. The horrifying reality of her situation was finally crushing her arrogant spirit. "But the management office gave us a key card. We told them it was a family emergency." "And you committed fraud to get it," I replied coldly. "You broke into a federal official's home with a crowbar and stole a vintage Cartier watch. Good luck with your arraignment hearing tomorrow morning." I pressed the end call button and set my phone face down on the marble kitchen island. I did not even have time to pour a second glass of wine before the screen lit up violently again. This time the caller ID flashed with Jamal's name. I swiped to answer, but before I spoke, I tapped the screen record function on my secure tablet. "Alyssa, what the hell did you do?" Jamal hissed into the phone. His voice vibrated with a suppressed, terrifying rage. The smooth, charismatic politician persona he wore for the cameras was completely obliterated. "I am having a lovely evening, Jamal. How is the campaign going?" I asked, keeping my tone light and conversational. "My campaign manager just got an urgent tip from a precinct insider," Jamal barked, completely ignoring my sarcasm. "My in-laws are currently sitting in a federal holding cell. The local press is going to be swarming the station by morning." "What exactly did you do to them?" "They broke into a stranger's luxury apartment in broad daylight and stole expensive jewelry," I replied calmly. "What exactly did you expect me to do about it?" "I expected you to handle your damn family," he yelled, his voice echoing in what sounded like his spacious home office. "Brittany is currently having a severe panic attack on the floor of our master bathroom. I am hosting a $10,000 a plate fundraiser tomorrow night for the city's elite. If this arrest record leaks to the papers, my biggest financial donors will pull their funding immediately. You are going to call that prosecutor. You are going to pay her off with whatever amount of money she wants, and you are going to fix this mess right now." "I am not bribing a federal official, Jamal. They made their choices. Listen to me very carefully." Jamal threatened, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I am a very powerful man in this city. If you do not handle this by midnight, I swear to God, Alyssa, I will use every political connection I have to ruin your tech career. I will have your company blacklisted from every corporate contract in the state." I leaned back in my leather chair, smiling brightly at the recording device. "Are you officially attempting to extort a witness in an ongoing federal investigation, Jamal? Because that sounds like another felony to add to the family collection." Jamal cursed loudly, unleashing a string of vicious profanities, and slammed the phone down. He honestly thought his political weight and aggressive intimidation tactics could bully me into submission. He did not realize that in the modern digital age, a senior cybersecurity consultant holds all the cards. I did not need to ruin his career. He was about to do it entirely by himself. My phone buzzed again, this time with a relentless barrage of text messages from my younger sister. Brittany was flooding my screen with unhinged accusations, her panic manifesting as pure, unfiltered venom. "You set them up," the first text read. "You gave them the wrong address on purpose because you are deeply jealous of my husband's success. You have always been a sick, vindictive loser." I watched the text bubbles pop up one after another. She was already spinning the narrative, desperately trying to cast herself and her husband as the innocent victims of my supposed mental instability. It was exactly the same tactic my parents had used my entire life, blaming me for their own terrible behavior. "My country club friends are already icing me out," another text read. "Jamal's donors are calling the house. If he loses this election because of you, I will sue you for everything you own. Answer the phone right now." I did not answer. I simply took a screenshot of her empty threats and saved them directly to my encrypted cloud drive. They were so predictable, so blindingly arrogant, that they could not see the massive legal avalanche heading straight for them. They thought they could bully their way out of a federal crime just like they had bullied their way through my childhood. I walked back over to my security monitors. The hallway feed from the fourth floor showed a crime scene cleanup crew repairing the minor damage to Kendra's front door lock. The bait had been taken, the trap had snapped shut flawlessly, and the predators were now locked safely in a cage. I closed the laptop, poured that second glass of Cabernet, and went to sleep knowing tomorrow was going to be the most entertaining day of my life. I tossed my phone onto the marble kitchen island and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked beautiful this time of day. The sun was just starting to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long golden shadows across the streets below. For the first time in my entire life, my chest felt completely light. There was no anxiety about the next family dinner. There was no lingering dread about what my parents would demand from me next. The heavy chain of obligation had finally snapped. My peace lasted exactly 4 minutes. The phone began to vibrate violently against the marble countertop. I did not even have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The ringtone was customized for Jamal. I picked up the device, but before I swiped to answer, I tapped the screen record application I had built specifically for client interactions. I hit accept and placed the phone on speaker. Jamal did not bother with a greeting. His voice came through the speaker as a tight, breathless hiss. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff. He demanded to know what the hell I had done to his meticulously managed political campaign. He frantically explained that his lead campaign manager had just received an urgent confidential tip from a precinct insider. He yelled that his wealthy, upstanding in-laws were currently sitting in a highly publicized federal holding cell downtown. I leaned against the counter, tracing the marble veins with my finger. I kept my tone absolutely flat. I told him they broke into a stranger's luxury apartment in broad daylight with a crowbar and stole expensive jewelry. I asked him what exactly he expected me to do about it. Jamal barked loudly, the polished politician completely gone. He shouted that he expected me to handle my own family. He claimed Brittany was currently having a severe, uncontrollable panic attack on their master bathroom floor. He stated he was hosting a $10,000 a plate political fundraiser tomorrow night for the city's most elite donors. He threatened that if this story leaked to the public, his most prominent financial backers would pull their funding immediately. He aggressively ordered me to call the prosecutor, pay her off with whatever amount of money she wanted, and fix this disastrous mess. I took a sip of my coffee. I calmly informed him that bribing a federal official was a serious crime and I would not be participating in his cover-up. Jamal lost his mind. He swore that if I did not handle it right now, he would use every single political connection he had to ruin my career in the tech industry forever. He promised to have my cybersecurity firm blacklisted from every corporate contract in the state. He thought his political weight and aggressive intimidation tactics could bully me into submission. I smiled warmly at the glowing recording icon on my screen. I sweetly asked Jamal if he was officially attempting to extort a federal witness in order to cover up a felony. Jamal cursed loudly, unleashing a string of vicious profanities, and slammed the phone down in a panic. He did not realize he was speeding toward his total public destruction. Almost immediately, my screen lit up again. This time, it was a relentless barrage of text messages from my younger sister. Brittany was flooding my phone with unhinged accusations, her panic manifesting as pure, unfiltered venom. The first text accused me of setting them up. She claimed I gave them the wrong address on purpose because I was deeply jealous of her husband's success. She called me a sick, vindictive loser. I watched the text bubbles pop up one after another. She was already spinning the narrative, desperately trying to cast herself and her husband as the innocent victims of my supposed mental instability. It was exactly the same tactic my parents had used my entire life. When I achieved perfect grades, they called me an antisocial nerd. When I launched a successful tech company, they called me a workaholic who would die alone. Now, when they committed a felony, they called me insane. Her next text declared that her country club friends were already icing her out. She said Jamal's donors were calling the house demanding answers. She threatened that if Jamal lost the city council election because of me, she would sue me for everything I owned. She demanded I answer the phone right this second. I did not answer. I simply took screenshots of her empty, desperate threats and saved them directly to my encrypted cloud drive. They were so predictable and so blindingly arrogant that they could not see the massive legal avalanche heading straight for them. They thought they could bully their way out of a federal crime, just like they had bullied their way through my childhood. I walked back over to my security monitors. The hallway feed from the fourth floor showed a crime scene cleanup crew repairing the minor damage to Kendra's front door lock. The bait had been taken. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. The predators were now locked safely in a cage. I closed the laptop and went to sleep, knowing tomorrow was going to be the most entertaining day of my life. By 6 in the morning the following day, the story broke wide open. I had not even needed to leak the arrest records myself. Kendra's high-profile status meant the federal and local arrest logs were heavily monitored by aggressive crime reporters looking for a scoop. My phone pinged with a breaking news alert from the city's largest digital publication. The headline was devastating. It announced that a prominent city council candidates-in-laws were arrested in a brazen daytime burglary of a federal prosecutor's home. The article included a highly unflattering high-resolution mugshot of Thomas looking disheveled and sweaty. Right next to it was Brenda with mascara smeared thickly under her eyes and a look of absolute terror on her face. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. News vans were already camped outside Jamal and Brittany's pristine suburban home, effectively trapping them inside. Instead of taking accountability, Jamal's panicked PR team issued a hasty and poorly worded press release. They claimed that Thomas and Brenda were suffering from severe age-related confusion and had accidentally entered the wrong apartment while trying to help their daughter move. It was a pathetic and transparent lie, desperate to control the narrative and save her lifestyle. Brittany took things a step further. She called into a popular local morning radio show. I listened to the live broadcast from my penthouse, taking meticulous notes. She crooned into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake, tearful sympathy. She claimed I had always struggled with severe mental instability and was deeply jealous of her husband's success. She told the host, "I deliberately gave my elderly parents the wrong address and orchestrated this entire misunderstanding to humiliate them." She was doubling down on the gaslighting, weaponizing my non-existent mental health issues to save her husband's doomed campaign. The radio host ate it up, offering thoughts and prayers for her family's difficult situation. My jaw clenched tight. Brittany thought she could spin a web of lies because she assumed there were no witnesses. She forgot who she was dealing with. I did not just have a witness. I had multiple angles of high-definition footage with crystal-clear audio. And it was time to share it with the world. I uploaded the audio file of Jamal's unhinged extortion attempt to 3 separate encrypted offshore servers before the dial tone even ended. Jamal was a desperate man backed into a corner, and desperate men make sloppy, fatal mistakes. My phone immediately started vibrating again against the marble countertop. This time it was a relentless barrage of text messages from my sister. Brittany was flooding my screen with wild accusations, her panic manifesting as pure unfiltered venom. She claimed I gave my parents the wrong address on purpose because I was deeply jealous of her husband's success. I did not bother replying. I simply took high-resolution screenshots of her empty threats and saved them alongside Jamal's audio file. They were building their own coffin, and I was just holding the nails. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the story exploded across the city. I had not even needed to leak the arrest records myself. Kendra's high-profile status as a federal prosecutor meant the federal and local arrest logs were heavily monitored by aggressive crime reporters looking for a scoop. My phone pinged with a breaking news alert from the city's largest digital publication. The headline was devastating. It announced that a prominent city council candidates-in-laws were arrested in a brazen daytime burglary of a federal prosecutor's home. The article included a highly unflattering, high-resolution mugshot of Thomas, looking disheveled, angry, and sweaty. Right next to it was Brenda with expensive mascara smeared thickly under her eyes and a look of absolute humiliating terror on her face. The political and social fallout was instantaneous and brutal. News vans were already camped outside Jamal and Brittany's pristine suburban home, effectively trapping them inside their own fortress of lies. Jamal's political donors, terrified of being associated with a federal crime and bad optics, began freezing their campaign contributions. My phone buzzed with another text from Brittany, screaming that her wealthy country club friends were officially icing her out and demanding I answer the phone to fix this. Instead of taking accountability, Jamal's panicked PR team issued a hasty and poorly worded press release. They claimed that Thomas and Brenda were suffering from severe age-related confusion and had accidentally entered the wrong apartment while trying to help their daughter move. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, but it was the only defense they had. Desperate to control the narrative and save her lavish lifestyle, Brittany took things a step further. She called into a popular local morning radio show. I listened to the live broadcast from the balcony of my penthouse, taking meticulous notes while sipping my coffee. She crooned into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake, tearful sympathy. She claimed I had always struggled with severe mental instability and was deeply jealous of her husband's success. She told the host, "I deliberately gave my elderly parents the wrong address and orchestrated this entire misunderstanding to humiliate them." She called me a deeply sick person who needed professional help. She was doubling down on the gaslighting, weaponizing my non-existent mental health issues to save her husband's doomed campaign. The radio host ate it up, offering thoughts and prayers for her family's difficult situation and praising Brittany for her strength. My jaw clenched tight. Brittany thought she could spin a web of lies because she assumed there were no witnesses to the break-in. She forgot who she was dealing with. I did not just have a witness. I had multiple angles of high-definition footage with crystal-clear audio, and it was time to share it with the world. I did not send the video to the radio station. That would be too messy and easily spun by Jamal's crisis management team. Instead, using a heavily encrypted, untraceable email server, I sent the entire hallway and interior video files directly to Jamal's primary political opponent. I also blind copied the top investigative journalists at the three major local news networks. The subject line simply read, "The absolute truth behind the age-related confusion." 2 hours later, the video was plastered across every major news network in the state. The public watched in high definition as frail and confused Thomas wielded a heavy steel crowbar with practiced force. They watched innocent Brenda shove a stolen Cartier watch into her pocket while loudly bragging about using my apartment as a personal storage unit. The internet exploded. The mental instability narrative Brittany had peddled that very morning was completely obliterated in seconds. The footage proved undeniable malicious intent. Jamal's campaign went into a total tailspin. Within an hour of the video leaking, Jamal called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall. Looking directly into the cameras and sweating profusely under the flashing lights, Jamal threw my parents directly under the bus. He stated he was appalled and disgusted by the criminal actions of his in-laws. His voice shook as he announced he had officially severed all ties with Thomas and Brenda, claiming their actions did not reflect his family's values. I was desperately trying to amputate the rotting limbs of his family tree to save the trunk of his political career. Thomas and Brenda, who had barely managed to scrape together their bail money by maxing out their remaining credit cards, returned to their house only to find themselves publicly disowned by the golden son-in-law they had just committed a felony for. The betrayal shattered them completely. They had sacrificed my mental health, my boundaries, and their own freedom for Jamal, and he had discarded them on national television the second they became a liability. At 8 o'clock that night, my private penthouse doorbell rang. I checked the security camera feed. It was Thomas and Brenda looking like ghosts of their former arrogant selves. Their clothes were wrinkled, their posture was slumped, and the defiant entitlement was entirely gone. I let them up, curious to see the absolute depths of their desperation. As soon as the custom elevator doors opened directly into my entryway, Brenda collapsed to her knees on the marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Thomas stood behind her, unable to even meet my eyes. I logged into my secure encrypted virtual private network and pulled up the high-definition video files I had extracted from Kendra's hallway and interior security cameras. Jamal wanted to play the age-related confusion card to save his political skin. He wanted to spin a calculated, sympathetic narrative of two elderly, befuddled parents making a harmless, innocent mistake. I hit attach on the video and audio files, then drafted a mass email directed to the exact local crime reporters who had just published Jamal's ridiculous press release. I also blind copied Jamal's primary political opponent and the top investigative anchors at the three major local news networks. The subject line was incredibly simple and entirely factual. It read, "The reality of the age-related confusion." I hit send, watched the progress bar vanish, and poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. It took exactly 42 minutes for the local television networks to completely scramble their morning programming. I sat comfortably at my marble kitchen island, watching the beautiful chaos unfold across my multiple monitors. The city's leading news anchor actually interrupted a live segment on local traffic to announce a massive breaking development in the city council race. They played the video completely unedited. There was my father Thomas, looking perfectly lucid and viciously aggressive as he drove a heavy steel crowbar into the doorframe. The audio was crystal clear. Every grunt of effort, every vile curse word, and every arrogant declaration was broadcast to millions of viewers across the entire state. Then came the interior footage. The public watched in stunning high definition as Brenda, my mother, greedily rummaged through a federal prosecutor's personal belongings. They heard her loud, entitled voice bragging about using my apartment as her own personal storage unit. They watched her confidently shove the velvet Cartier watch box into her pocket with practiced, undeniable ease. There was no confusion. There was no innocent mistake. It was a brazen, calculated burglary executed by two deeply arrogant people who believed the rules simply did not apply to them. The internet exploded almost instantly. The contrast between Jamal's highly sanitized sympathetic press release and the blatant malicious criminal act caught on tape was absolutely catastrophic. Social media platforms lit up with trending hashtags demanding Jamal drop out of the race. Jamal's campaign credibility evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. My phone buzzed with an alert from a major political news blog. Jamal's senior campaign manager had just resigned via a highly public social media post, officially citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for criminal behavior. Jamal's major donors, who had simply frozen their funds earlier that morning, were now actively releasing statements demanding public refunds. The pristine suburban fortress Jamal and Brittany had built was crumbling stone by stone live on the internet. But the most spectacular disaster of the morning was still unfolding. Brittany, trapped inside her house by a swarm of paparazzi and completely oblivious to the fact that the security footage had just gone viral, decided to take matters into her own hands. Desperate to save her lavish lifestyle and her husband's doomed career, she called into the city's most popular morning radio talk show. I switched my audio feed to the station, genuinely astounded by her sheer audacity. She crooned into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake tearful sympathy. She told the host that I had struggled with severe mental instability for years, and that I was deeply pathologically jealous of Jamal's financial success. She claimed I deliberately gave our elderly parents the wrong address to humiliate them. She weaponized my non-existent mental health issues to save herself, utilizing the exact same gaslighting tactics our parents had used my entire life to dismiss my achievements and elevate hers. She fully expected the host to offer thoughts and prayers for her difficult family situation. Instead, there was a heavy, incredibly awkward pause on the air. The radio host, a notorious shock jock known for his absolute lack of mercy, cleared his throat loudly. He stated live on air that they were currently watching the newly released security footage. He asked Brittany how her parents' severe age-related confusion magically allowed them to skillfully pick a secondary deadbolt and aggressively demand the contents of a hidden safe. Brittany's fake, tearful persona instantly shattered. She let out a sharp, breathless, panicked gasp that echoed over the radio waves. She stammered out a series of completely incoherent syllables before screaming that the video was a malicious deepfake generated by my cybersecurity company. The host laughed directly into the microphone, called her a delusional liar to her face, and hung up the phone. It was absolute, unmitigated social destruction. By noon, Jamal was backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He called a sudden emergency press conference on the sidewalk right outside his front door. He stood sweating profusely under the harsh glare of a dozen camera lenses. Brittany stood trembling behind him, her face completely hidden behind massive designer sunglasses, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. Jamal did not defend his family. He did not ask the public for privacy or grace. He threw Thomas and Brenda directly under the nearest, heaviest bus he could find. Looking straight into the news cameras, Jamal stated he was appalled and thoroughly disgusted by the malicious criminal actions of his in-laws. His voice shook slightly as he announced he had officially severed all personal and financial ties with Thomas and Brenda. He claimed their actions were entirely their own and did not reflect his moral values or his campaign. He was desperately amputating the rotting limbs of his family tree to save the core trunk of his political career. Thomas and Brenda had barely managed to scrape together enough cash to cover their bail bonds by maxing out their remaining credit cards. They walked out of the downtown precinct holding their personal belongings in clear plastic bags, stepping right into a swarm of aggressive paparazzi. They were forced to watch Jamal's press conference on a reporter's smartphone screen in the precinct parking lot. The ultimate betrayal had finally arrived. They had sacrificed my boundaries, my privacy, and their own freedom to serve their golden child and her perfect husband. And Jamal had discarded them on national television the very second they became a political liability. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my private penthouse intercom buzzed. I pulled up the building's exterior security feed on my tablet. Standing on the sidewalk looking like hollowed-out ghosts of their former arrogant selves were Thomas and Brenda. They had no money, no golden child to protect them, and nowhere else to go. I did not send the video files to the police precinct. Kendra had already ensured law enforcement possessed the security footage. Instead, I opened my encrypted email server and drafted a message to the executive producer of the exact morning radio show currently broadcasting my sister's tearful lies. I attached a secure direct download link containing the unedited security feeds from both the hallway and the interior of the apartment. I kept the subject line incredibly simple and entirely factual. It read, "Video evidence of the burglary." I hit send, leaned back in my leather chair, and turned up the volume on my receiver. It took exactly 3 minutes for the producer to review the files and flag the host. Over the radio, Brittany was still sniffing dramatically, detailing a completely fabricated story about how I once threw a chair at her during Thanksgiving. The radio host, a notorious shock jock who prioritized ratings over everything else, suddenly cut her off mid-sentence. He cleared his throat loudly into the microphone. He announced to his massive listening audience that his producer had just handed him a very interesting piece of breaking evidence regarding the city council candidate's family. He asked Brittany if she was absolutely certain her parents had accidentally wandered into the wrong apartment due to age-related confusion. Brittany answered with practiced wounded innocence. She swore on her children's lives that it was a tragic, honest mistake orchestrated by my supposed vindictiveness. The host did not hesitate. He hit a button on his soundboard, broadcasting the raw, unedited audio from Kendra's hallway security camera directly across the airwaves. The unmistakable heavy metallic thud of a steel crowbar smashing against a reinforced door frame echoed through the radio. Then came my father's voice, perfectly lucid and viciously aggressive, grunting with effort as he splintered the wood. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the radio broadcast. Brittany stopped crying instantly. I could practically hear the blood draining from her face. The host was merciless. He then played the interior audio. Millions of morning commuters listened in crystal clear high definition as my mother greedily rummaged through a federal prosecutor's personal belongings. They heard Brenda's loud, entitled voice bragging about using my former apartment as her own personal storage unit. They heard the exact moment she shoved the velvet Cartier watch box into her pocket with practiced, undeniable ease. The host asked Brittany how her parents' severe mental decline magically allowed them to skillfully operate a heavy burglary tool and accurately appraise vintage luxury jewelry. Brittany panicked. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp that echoed over the air. She stammered out a series of completely incoherent syllables before screaming that audio was a malicious deepfake generated by my cybersecurity company. She shrieked that I was trying to frame them. The host laughed directly into the microphone, called her a delusional liar to her face, and abruptly cut her microphone feed. I then spent the next 10 minutes ruthlessly mocking Jamal's entire political campaign. The social destruction was instantaneous. By noon, the video footage had been picked up by every major local news network and was trending wildly across social media. The internet exploded. The contrast between Jamal's highly sanitized, sympathetic press release and the blatant, malicious criminal act caught on tape was absolutely catastrophic. Voters were furious. The mental instability narrative Brittany had peddled that very morning was completely obliterated in seconds. The footage proved undeniable malicious intent. Jamal's political campaign went into a total unrecoverable tailspin. My phone buzzed with a news alert from a major political blog. Jamal's senior campaign manager had just resigned via a highly public social media post, officially citing a strict zero-tolerance policy for criminal behavior. Jamal's major financial donors, who had simply frozen their funds earlier that morning, were now actively releasing legal statements demanding full public refunds. The pristine suburban fortress Jamal and Brittany had built was crumbling stone by stone live on the internet. Jamal was backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He called a sudden emergency press conference on the sidewalk right outside his front door. I watched the live feed on my tablet. He stood sweating profusely under the harsh glare of a dozen camera lenses. Brittany stood trembling slightly behind him, her face completely hidden behind massive designer sunglasses, clutching her leather handbag like a life preserver. Jamal did not defend his family. He did not ask the public for privacy or grace. He threw Thomas and Brenda directly under the nearest heaviest bus he could find, looking straight into the news cameras. Jamal stated he was appalled and thoroughly disgusted by the malicious criminal actions of his in-laws. His voice shook slightly as he announced he had officially severed all personal and financial ties with Thomas and Brenda. He claimed their actions were entirely their own and did not reflect his moral values or his campaign. He was desperately amputating the rotting limbs of his family tree to save the core trunk of his political career. Thomas and Brenda had barely managed to scrape together enough cash to cover their bail bonds by maxing out their remaining credit cards. They walked out of the downtown precinct, holding their personal belongings in clear plastic bags, stepping right into a swarm of aggressive paparazzi. They were forced to watch Jamal's press conference on a reporter's smartphone screen right there in the precinct parking lot. The ultimate betrayal had finally arrived. My parents had sacrificed my boundaries, my privacy, and their own freedom to serve their golden child and her perfect husband. Now Jamal had discarded them on national television the very second they became a political liability. They had nothing left. No money, no public standing, and no family left to exploit. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my private penthouse intercom buzzed. I pulled up the building's exterior security feed on my tablet. Standing on the sidewalk looking like hollowed-out ghosts of their former arrogant selves were Thomas and Brenda. They were shivering in the evening air, staring up at the security camera with absolute desperation. The flashes of the press cameras reflected off the sweat beading on Jamal's forehead. I watched the live broadcast from my living room, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. He was desperately amputating the rotting limbs of his family tree to save the core trunk of his political career. He stepped away from the podium, ignoring the barrage of shouted questions from the press pool. Brittany trailed closely behind him, her head ducked low, her massive designer sunglasses, failing to hide the absolute panic contorting her face. They ducked into a black SUV and sped away from the plaza. Less than 10 miles away, Thomas and Brenda were sitting in the fluorescent-lit waiting area of a predatory bail bonds office. They had just surrendered the titles to their two remaining vehicles to secure their temporary release. I knew this because my father's cell phone pinged my caller ID exactly 3 minutes after Jamal's press conference ended. I answered the call, hitting the record button out of sheer habit. My father's voice was a hollow, trembling rasp. The arrogant roar was completely gone. He begged me to let them come over to the penthouse. He frantically explained that reporters were swarming their house, and Jamal had ordered the security guards at his gated community to deny them entry. They had nowhere to go. Brenda sobbed loudly in the background, a pathetic, broken sound that would have shattered my heart a decade ago. Now it just sounded like consequences. I kept my voice pleasant and perfectly even. I reminded him that they had broken into a federal official's home, destroyed her property, and attempted to steal luxury jewelry. I told them my luxury building had a strict policy against allowing violent felons past the lobby. I suggested they find a cheap highway motel and hung up blocking their numbers permanently. They had sacrificed my boundaries, my privacy, and their own freedom to serve their golden child. Now that golden child had discarded them on national television the second they became a liability. But Jamal's nightmare was far from over. He actually believed his cowardly press conference had saved him. He thought sacrificing my parents would create a sufficient firewall between his pristine reputation and their criminal charges. He wildly underestimated my commitment to total destruction. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Jamal sent me a secure encrypted text message. It was a singular display of breathtaking arrogance. The message read, "The trash has been taken out. Keep your mouth shut and your little tech company survives. We are done here." He was still trying to play the power broker. He was still trying to intimidate me into silence. I smiled at the screen. I typed my reply slowly. "We are definitely done here, Jamal. Enjoy your fundraiser tonight." I then opened my secure cloud drive and retrieved the audio file from the night before. I played back the crystal clear recording of Jamal screaming at me, demanding I bribe a federal prosecutor and threatening to use his political connections to destroy my cybersecurity firm. It was textbook extortion, it was witness tampering, and it was a federal crime carrying a much heavier sentence than simple burglary. I did not send this file to the news stations. Jamal was right about one thing. This was a family matter, and it needed to be handled by the proper authorities. I drafted a highly professional email directly to Kendra, the federal prosecutor, whose apartment my parents had just vandalized. I attached the audio file. I wrote a brief statement explaining that the brother-in-law of the suspects was actively attempting to intimidate witnesses and orchestrate a financial payoff to drop the federal charges. I hit send and watched the progress bar disappear. The trap was no longer just a snare, it was a steel vault, and I had just spun the lock. The evening rolled in, painting the city skyline in brilliant shades of orange and purple. At 7 o'clock, Jamal's $10,000 a plate fundraiser began at the most exclusive country club in the metropolitan area. I monitored the event through a series of live social media feeds posted by the wealthy attendees. Jamal was working the room wearing a tailored tuxedo, flashing his charismatic smile and aggressively spinning the narrative. He was playing the tragic victim, the noble public servant who had been blindsided by his mentally unstable in-laws. Brittany stood by his side in a stunning silver evening gown, holding a crystal glass of champagne, playing the resilient, supportive political wife. They looked flawless. They looked untouchable. At 7:45, the social media feeds suddenly went chaotic. The smooth jazz playing in the background of a live stream abruptly cut off. I leaned forward in my leather chair, expanding the video to full screen on my main monitor. The heavy oak doors of the country club ballroom swung open violently. The wealthy donors gasped and murmured in confusion. Walking through those doors, completely bypassing the panicked event staff, was a team of federal agents wearing dark suits and severe expressions. Leading them was Kendra, looking incredibly sharp in a tailored charcoal blazer. She marched straight across the ballroom floor, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. The sea of elite socialites parted for her instantly. Jamal's charismatic smile froze, then slowly melted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. He tried to step backward, but two agents flanked him immediately. Kendra did not lower her voice. She projected her words so every single high-rolling donor in that cavernous room could hear her perfectly. She informed Jamal he was under arrest for felony witness tampering, extortion, and attempting to bribe a federal official. Brittany dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the sharp crack echoing through the stunned silence of the ballroom. She lunged forward, screaming wildly at the agents, demanding they unhand her husband, violently insisting that they were important people, and this was a massive mistake. An agent stepped neatly into her path, holding up a solid hand to stop her frantic assault. He warned her that if she interfered with a federal arrest, she would be leaving in handcuffs alongside him. Jamal's face was completely bloodless. The polished, powerful politician was gone. In his place was a terrified, pathetic man, realizing his entire empire had just evaporated into thin air. The agent snapped the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click was clearly audible on the live stream. They marched him out of the ballroom, parading him past his most important financial backers, past the local elite, and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting in the circular driveway. Brittany was left standing entirely alone in the center of the ballroom. The wealthy socialites she had spent years kissing up to were already turning their backs, whispering furiously, and speed-walking toward the exits to avoid being associated with a federal raid. Her perfect marriage, her flawless reputation, and her endless supply of unearned wealth were entirely gone. My private cell phone lit up on the desk. It was a FaceTime request from Brittany. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute victory, and swiped to accept. "That sounds like a personal problem," I said coldly. Brenda's dramatic wails echoed off the high marble walls of my foyer. She reached out with shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the hem of my silk robe. I took a deliberate step back, ensuring her perfectly manicured fingers grasped nothing but empty air. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with a pathetic, desperate anger. He aggressively demanded I stop being vindictive and immediately help my family. He shouted that blood was thicker than water, and I owed them my financial support in their darkest hour. I laughed. It was a harsh, sharp sound that silenced Brenda's sobbing instantly. I told them they were not my family. I firmly clarified that they were simply Brittany's accomplices. I reminded them of every single holiday they spent praising Jamal's imaginary brilliance, every financial handout they gave Brittany, while violently demanding rent from me, the very day I turned 18. I told them they had happily handed their golden child the keys to their entire financial future, and she had driven it straight off a cliff to save a man who was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. Thomas tried to argue, his voice cracking with panic. He claimed Brittany was just overwhelmed and would absolutely pay them back once the campaign recovered from this minor setback. I pulled my secure tablet from the entryway console. I told them Jamal's campaign was entirely dead and their money was gone forever. I pulled up a sophisticated financial tracing program I routinely used for corporate embezzlement cases. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass the basic outdated security of their joint banking portal using the credentials they had foolishly shared with my sister. I turned the glowing screen toward them. I showed them exactly where their entire life savings went. Brittany did not pay a high-end crisis management firm. She had wired the entire balance to a newly opened, deeply private offshore account in the Cayman Islands under her maiden name. She was not trying to save her husband's political career. She was rapidly liquidating every available asset to flee the jurisdiction before the federal investigators realized she was deeply complicit in Jamal's financial extortion schemes. The remaining color completely drained from Thomas's face. He staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he had been physically shot. Brenda stopped crying. A look of absolute horrifying realization washed over her heavily wrinkled features. Their perfect daughter, the woman they had sacrificed my mental health and their own freedom to protect, had just robbed them blind and was actively preparing to abandon them to the federal justice system. I told them they had exactly 10 seconds to get out of my penthouse before I called building security and had them arrested for trespassing. Thomas grabbed Brenda by the arm, violently hauling her to her feet. They did not say another word. They stumbled back into the custom elevator, visibly broken and completely ruined. The polished steel doors slid shut effectively, sealing away the last remnants of my toxic childhood. The next morning, the financial and legal avalanche finally reached its terrifying peak. The federal authorities who raided Jamal's elite fundraiser did not just arrest him for extortion and witness tampering. They executed a massive, coordinated search warrant on his campaign headquarters and his pristine suburban home simultaneously. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the local news networks were running nonstop coverage of FBI agents carrying heavy boxes of financial documents and encrypted hard drives out of Jamal's residence. It turned out Jamal had been running a massive wire fraud scheme for years, illegally siphoning campaign donations into his personal luxury real estate business to fund their lavish lifestyle. And Brittany was legally listed as the primary financial officer for his holding company. The feds immediately froze every single one of their domestic bank accounts. The Cayman Islands transfer she had made with my parents' retirement money was instantly flagged by the International Banking Commission and seized by the Department of Justice pending a massive fraud investigation. Brittany was completely trapped. She had no money, no passport, and a massive federal target painted on her back. At exactly noon, my luxury building's front desk concierge called my private line. He sounded highly alarmed and deeply apologetic. He informed me that my sister was currently screaming at the security guards in the main lobby, violently demanding they let her up to my penthouse. She was throwing a massive, unhinged tantrum in front of several wealthy, influential residents. I instructed the concierge to keep her contained in the lobby and immediately called the local precinct to report a violent trespasser. I then accessed the high-definition lobby security cameras from my workstation. Brittany looked absolutely deranged. Her expensive designer clothes were heavily wrinkled. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, and she was violently kicking the heavy glass security turnstiles. She was screaming my name completely unhinged, wildly claiming to anyone who would listen that I had hacked her bank accounts and framed her innocent husband. I took the private elevator down to the mezzanine level, standing quietly on the glass balcony overlooking the expansive marble lobby. I wanted to watch her absolute destruction in person. Brittany looked up and spotted me standing there. Her eyes went wide with pure feral rage. She lunged against the massive security guard, screaming at the top of her lungs that I ruined her perfect life. She shrieked that she was going to kill me, that I owed her my unearned wealth, and that she would use her lawyers to take my entire cybersecurity company away from me. I simply smiled down at her and tapped the glass face of my gold watch. Right on cue. Two local police cruisers pulled up aggressively to the front glass doors of the building. Four uniformed officers stepped swiftly into the lobby. Brittany froze instantly. The ferocious, entitled anger morphed back into pathetic, trembling panic. She tried to back away from the turnstiles, suddenly claiming with a shaky voice that it was just a minor family dispute and she was voluntarily leaving. The officers were not interested in her pathetic excuses. They recognized her immediately from the morning news broadcasts. The lead officer informed her that there was an active federal warrant out for her arrest regarding campaign wire fraud and the illegal financial exploitation of a senior citizen's retirement fund. Brittany collapsed completely. She did not fight them. She simply went limp on the polished marble floor, sobbing hysterically as they snapped the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. She looked up at the mezzanine balcony, begging me to help her, screaming that we were blood sisters and she was terrified of going to federal prison. I looked down at the woman who had spent 34 years making my life a living hell. I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, satisfying peace. I turned my back, walked gracefully toward my private elevator, and pressed the button for the penthouse, leaving her to face the brutal, unavoidable reality of her own actions. I picked up my phone and forwarded Brittany's extortion text directly to my lead corporate attorney, Evelyn. Evelyn charged $1,000 an hour and was worth every single penny. I called her immediately after sending the screenshot. She answered on the first ring, chuckling darkly into the receiver. She had already read the civil complaint filed by Thomas and his bargain bin lawyer. Evelyn called it a legal suicide note. The claim of entrapment was fundamentally impossible because I was a private citizen, not a law enforcement officer. The demand for eviction was even more comical, but it provided the perfect opportunity to deliver the ultimate killing blow to my family's remaining arrogance. I instructed Evelyn to set up an in-person mediation meeting. I wanted to look my father in the eye when I crushed his last remaining shred of hope. I had Evelyn's assistant book the main executive conference room on the ground floor of my luxury building for the following afternoon. I sent a brief formal email to Thomas's attorney, a man named Richard Vance, stating I was willing to sit down and discuss the terms of their civil complaint. Richard replied within 5 minutes. His tone was dripping with unearned victory. He demanded I bring a certified cashier's check for the full $500,000 to avoid a drawn-out media spectacle. I printed his email and added it to my growing physical binder of evidence. The next day, at precisely 2 in the afternoon, Thomas and Brenda swaggered into the executive conference room. The sheer audacity of their posture was mind-boggling. Despite facing federal felony charges and total financial ruin, they strutted in like they owned the place. Richard Vance walked in behind them, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit and carrying a scuffed briefcase. He looked exactly like the kind of bottom-feeding attorney who would take a desperate, unwinnable case strictly for a percentage of a non-existent settlement. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table flanked by Evelyn and two of her sharpest junior associates. Richard Vance did not even bother to sit down. He threw his briefcase onto the polished wood, popped the latches, and pulled out a stack of poorly drafted settlement papers. He puffed out his chest and launched into a highly rehearsed, aggressive monologue. He accused me of orchestrating a malicious trap to ruin my father's pristine reputation. He claimed his clients were suffering from severe emotional distress and devastating public humiliation. He then slammed a greasy finger onto the eviction demand. He stated that if I did not sign the settlement and hand over the check, immediately he would personally march up to the property management office and force them to evict me for creating a hostile living environment. I let him finish his entire blustering speech. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. Thomas sneered at me from across the table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He confidently told me to stop dragging this out and just pay what I owed my family. He said I owed them for raising me. I looked over at Evelyn and gave her a slight nod. Evelyn stood up smoothly, buttoning her tailored suit jacket. She slid a single crisp manila folder across the table toward Richard. Evelyn calmly informed Richard that he had made a catastrophic error in his preliminary public records research. She pointed out that his eviction demand was addressed to the property management company. Evelyn smiled, displaying a cold, predatory expression that made Richard instinctively take a step back. She explained that the property management company did not own the building. They were merely contracted employees hired to handle maintenance and concierge services. She then instructed Richard to read the certified deed of ownership inside the folder. Richard snatched the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon rapidly. His face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish. The deed clearly stated that my private investment firm had purchased the entire luxury high-rise building entirely in cash 8 months ago. I was not a tenant. I was the sole owner and the primary landlord of the entire property. Thomas and Brenda had just tried to threaten the landlord with an eviction notice from her own building. Richard turned his horrifying realization toward my father. He demanded to know why Thomas had not informed him that his daughter owned the property. Thomas stammered, looking frantically between Richard and me. He desperately claimed I was just a computer nerd, and there was absolutely no way I had that kind of money. Richard realized instantly that he had been completely played by his own clients. I was actively attempting to extort a high-net-worth individual who possessed infinite legal resources. Evelyn did not give them a single moment to recover. She slid a second, much thicker folder across the table. She officially served Richard with a devastating countersuit. We were suing Thomas, Brenda, and Richard's law firm for frivolous litigation, malicious prosecution, and severe defamation. Furthermore, Evelyn announced she was filing an immediate formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding Richard's blatant extortion attempt via email, providing printed copies of his demands for a cashier's check. Richard panicked entirely. He shoved his messy papers back into his briefcase with trembling, uncoordinated hands. He screamed at Thomas, calling him a delusional idiot who just ruined his law practice. Richard loudly declared he was formally withdrawing as their legal counsel, effective immediately. He sprinted out of the conference room, leaving my parents completely defenseless and entirely alone. Thomas and Brenda sat frozen in their leather chairs, the absolute magnitude of their failure finally crushing whatever delusions of grandeur they had left. The threat they thought would save them had just guaranteed their absolute destruction. I stood up, smoothing the front of my silk blouse. I told them my security team would be escorting them off my property permanently. Just as the guards placed their hands on my father's shoulders to guide him out, my cell phone vibrated on the table. The caller ID displayed Kendra's name. I answered it on speakerphone. The federal prosecutor's voice was crisp and strictly professional. She informed me that Brittany had just made a full recorded confession regarding the wire fraud scheme, but she was demanding a plea deal. Brittany was officially offering to testify that Thomas and Brenda were the actual criminal masterminds who forced her to steal the campaign funds. I looked at my parents. The sheer horror in their eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Yes, Mr. Vance, my attorney," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom like a freshly sharpened blade. "My client acquired the property 8 months ago entirely in cash. She is the sole proprietor of the holding company, which means your clients did not just attempt to weaponize a property management firm against a tenant. They attempted to extort the legal owner of the building using a completely fabricated civil claim." Judge Harrison leaned forward over his heavy oak desk, his expression darkening into a scowl of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He looked down at the cheap, sweating lawyer standing next to my parents. He asked Mr. Vance if he had failed to perform even a basic public records search before filing this petition. He loudly questioned if the attorney had actually served an eviction demand to a property owner on behalf of the very people who had violently broken into her building. Richard Vance physically recoiled as if he had been struck. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a cheap suit. He scrambled to gather his messy handwritten legal pads, his hands shaking so violently that he knocked a water glass over on the plaintiff's table. He stammered a pathetic, breathless apology to the bench, frantically claiming his clients had intentionally misled him regarding the ownership status of the residence. High declared he was withdrawing the petition immediately. He refused to even look at my father as he loudly announced he was formally withdrawing as counsel for the plaintiffs effective immediately. "Not so fast, Mr. Vance," Evelyn interrupted smoothly. She did not raise her voice, but the absolute crushing authority in her tone froze the cheap lawyer in his tracks. "Your Honor, we object to a simple withdrawal. The plaintiffs and their counsel used this frivolous lawsuit to actively attempt to extort a $500,000 settlement from my client. I have printed copies of Mr. Vance's email correspondence demanding a certified cashier's check to make this issue quietly disappear. This was not a legal filing, this was a shakedown." Evelyn approached the bench, handing a secondary, heavily indexed file to the bailiff. The judge opened it, his eyes scanning the aggressive extortion emails Thomas and his lawyer had sent just 48 hours prior. Thomas slammed his heavy hands down on the plaintiff's table. He was completely incapable of understanding that his lifelong bullying tactics did not work in a federal court of law. He shouted angrily at the judge, claiming I was a vindictive liar and a spoiled, ungrateful brat who owed him for raising me. He demanded the judge force me to pay for his federal defense lawyers immediately because blood was thicker than water and family protected family. Judge Harrison slammed his wooden gavel down with enough force to echo through the large room like a gunshot. He ordered my father to sit down and close his mouth immediately or face a direct, non-bailable charge of criminal contempt. Thomas flinched violently, finally realizing that the man in the black robe possessed actual tangible authority, unlike the hollow manipulative power my father had wielded over our family for decades. He collapsed back into his chair, breathing heavily, his arrogant posture completely shattered. The judge stated loudly that this was without a doubt the most egregious abuse of the civil court system he had seen in his entire 30-year career. He pointed directly at Thomas and Brenda, his voice radiating pure contempt. He noted they had broken into a federal official's home, been arrested for multiple violent felonies, and then had the absolute audacity to sue the building owner for entrapment. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice and immediately granted our motion for maximum financial sanctions. Brenda let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning completely white. She looked frantically at the empty space where their lawyer had just been standing, her voice trembling as she asked what sanctions meant. The judge looked directly down at her, his face devoid of any sympathy. He informed Brenda that she and her husband were now legally responsible for paying every single penny of my corporate legal fees. Given the high-tier caliber of representation I had retained, he firmly suggested they prepare to liquidate whatever assets they had left in their names. "They do not have any assets left, Your Honor," Evelyn stated clearly, turning slightly to look directly at the gallery. Which brings us to the matter of the coordinated harassment campaign. Brittany, who had been sitting completely frozen in the second row of the wooden gallery benches, suddenly stood up. Her oversized designer sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose, revealing eyes wide with pure, unfiltered panic. Evelyn continued her ruthless, calculated takedown. She told the court the plaintiffs claimed in their initial filing that my actions caused their severe financial ruin. However, subpoenaed banking records obtained at 6 o'clock this morning proved that their financial destitution was actually caused by their other daughter. Evelyn held up a verified bank ledger. She announced that Brittany Davis had transferred the entirety of her parents' remaining retirement funds into an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands under her maiden name just before Jamal's federal raid. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic buzz of whispers from the court staff and the bailiffs. Thomas and Brenda whipped their heads around to stare at the gallery. The betrayal hit them with the physical crushing force of a freight train. Thomas grabbed his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he stared at the golden child he had sacrificed everything to protect. Brenda let out a guttural, agonizing wail, finally understanding that her favorite daughter had robbed them entirely blind to save herself. Brittany did not even try to defend them. She did not offer a single word of apology or explanation. Pure survival instinct took over completely. She turned on her expensive designer heels and sprinted toward the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom. She shoved them open with all her might, desperately trying to flee the jurisdiction before the walls fully closed in on her. She slammed directly into a solid wall of dark federal suits. Standing in the courthouse hallway were three heavily armed federal agents, led by Kendra. The federal prosecutor looked absolutely flawless in a sharp navy blue tailored suit, her expression carved from pure, unforgiving ice. Brittany screamed, thrashing wildly, as the agents immediately grabbed her arms and slammed her forcefully against the polished marble wall of the corridor. The metallic, heavy click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly into the silent courtroom. Kendra stepped right up to my sister, pulling a folded legal document from her jacket pocket. She loudly informed Brittany that she was being placed under federal arrest for felony wire fraud, gross embezzlement, and attempting to flee the country to avoid federal prosecution. Thomas and Brenda watched the entire scene unfold from the plaintiff's table. They were completely paralyzed. The arrogant, untouchable family dynamic they had violently enforced for 34 years had just been entirely eradicated in less than 20 minutes. They had no money, no lawyer, a mountain of federal charges pending against them, and a massive civil debt they could never possibly repay. I stood up from the defense table, smoothly buttoning my tailored blazer. I did not look back at my parents. I did not offer a single word of sympathy, anger, or closure. They simply did not matter anymore. They did not deserve my time, and they certainly did not deserve my energy. I walked calmly down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the polished floor. As I passed the gallery, I locked eyes with Kendra out in the hallway. She gave me a single, deeply respectful nod. The trap had worked flawlessly. The predators had turned on each other, tearing their own lives to absolute shreds, while I simply provided the stage for their total destruction. I walked out the front doors of the courthouse, stepping out into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight of the city. For the first time in my entire life, the air felt incredibly clean. The heavy chains of familial obligation were permanently broken, and the future was entirely mine. I did not even look back as I walked down the marble steps of the courthouse. Brittany shrieked my name, her voice echoing off the stone columns, but the sound was quickly drowned out by the chaotic roar of the press corps waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Evelyn walked smoothly beside me, her briefcase held firmly in one hand. She casually signaled to the two private security contractors I had hired for the afternoon. They immediately stepped between my sister and me, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. Brittany crashed hard into the chest of a massive security guard. She practically foamed at the mouth, screaming that she was going to sue me for every single building I owned. She yelled that I owed her half of my assets because we were family. The journalists, hungry for the next chapter of this massive political scandal, instantly turned their heavy cameras and glaring spotlights directly onto her unhinged meltdown. They captured every single second of the golden child completely losing her grip on reality. I slipped quietly into the back of my waiting black car. Evelyn slid in right next to me, tapping her tablet screen. She informed me that the bank handling my parents' second mortgage was not just waiting for a standard foreclosure timeline. Because the loan was secured using fraudulently obtained signatures, and the funds were immediately transferred to an illegal political campaign account, the bank had filed an emergency seizure motion. Evelyn smiled her terrifying, predatory smile. She told me the local sheriff was executing the lockout order on my parents' suburban home at this exact moment. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the car's small refrigerator. I watched the live news feed on the monitor, mounted to the back of the front seat. The local news chopper was already circling high above the pristine gated neighborhood where I had spent my miserable childhood. The aerial camera zoomed in closely on the front lawn. My jaw tightened into a smile of absolute satisfaction. There was a heavy commercial moving truck parked violently on my parents' perfectly manicured grass. 3 uniformed sheriff's deputies were standing on the front porch. The front door was wide open, and professional movers were hauling my parents' expensive custom-made furniture out onto the driveway. The country club neighbors, the exact people Brenda had spent decades trying to impress at the cost of my emotional well-being, were standing on their sidewalks, openly recording the entire humiliating eviction on their smartphones. The news feed cut to a split screen. On the right side, the live camera showed Thomas and Brenda finally arriving at their street in a cheap rented taxi. They stepped out of the cab, freezing completely as they took in the catastrophic scene. Brenda let out a sound so loud and full of despair that the news microphones picked it up from 50 feet away. She ran frantically toward the porch, screaming at the deputies that they had the wrong house and demanding they put her expensive imported rugs back inside immediately. The lead deputy simply handed her a thick stack of legal eviction papers and physically stepped in front of the door, blocking her from entering her own home. Thomas collapsed onto the curb, sitting right next to a black trash bag filled with his golf clubs. He looked like a deflated balloon. The massive suburban fortress where he had ruled our family with an iron fist, where he had constantly reminded me that I was a worthless disappointment, was gone. They were entirely homeless, absolutely broke and facing federal prison time. But the dominoes were not done falling. The conflict flow in this family was a continuous self-destructing machine. My tablet buzzed with the priority alert. It was a mass email sent out by Jamal's highly expensive criminal defense team. In a desperate cutthroat maneuver to secure a favorable plea deal for his extortion and witness tampering charges, Jamal was actively detonating his own marriage. He officially filed for divorce from Brittany and publicly released a statement completely disavowing her. The attached press release was completely ruthless. Jamal claimed he was a victim of his wife's financial manipulation. He stated he had absolutely no idea Brittany had drained her parents' retirement accounts or that she had opened a secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands. To prove his supposed innocence, his lawyers leaked a deeply incriminating audio recording to the press. I tapped the audio file. It was a recording from a home security camera inside Jamal and Brittany's kitchen dated 3 days before the federal raid. The audio was crystal clear. It featured Brittany frantically pacing the floor, explicitly bragging to Jamal about how easy it was to trick our parents into signing away their entire retirement fund. She laughed coldly on the tape, calling Thomas and Brenda gullible fools who would gladly jump off a bridge if she told them it would help the campaign. She detailed her exact plan to wire the money offshore so the federal government could not touch it. I closed the audio file, shaking my head in pure disbelief. Jamal had secretly recorded his own wife confessing to major financial felonies just so he could use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card when the authorities finally closed in. The sheer sociopathic betrayal was astounding. He had thrown Thomas and Brenda under the bus first, and now he was throwing Brittany into the exact same wood chipper. Evelyn watched my screen and laughed softly. She stated that with that recording public, the federal prosecutor would immediately revoke Brittany's bail. The golden child was entirely trapped by her own greed and her husband's absolute cowardice. I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the city skyline roll past the tinted windows. The villains in my story had completely annihilated themselves. They had traded basic human decency for arrogance and greed, and the bill had finally come due. Just as the car pulled up to the private underground entrance of my luxury high-rise, my personal phone rang. The caller ID was restricted, but my custom security software immediately bypassed the block. The screen displayed the main switchboard number for the local county jail. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so Evelyn could hear. An automated voice announced, it was a collect call from an inmate at the county detention center. The robotic voice asked if I would accept the charges from Brittany. I tapped the accept button, genuinely curious to hear what the golden child could possibly say now that she had hit absolute rock bottom. The line clicked over. Brittany was hyperventilating so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. She screamed into the receiver, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant polish. She begged me to call my corporate lawyers and get her out of there. She cried that the federal marshals had just arrested her at a coffee shop, and Jamal had locked her completely out of all their joint bank accounts. She swore she would do anything I wanted, promising to publicly apologize on national television if I just paid her massive bail. She genuinely believed I was still the obedient family scapegoat ready to fix her messes because of some twisted sense of loyalty. She thought the rules of our childhood still applied. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the absolute silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment over the phone line. I looked at Evelyn, who was smiling like a shark. I leaned down toward the microphone. I told Brittany she dialed the wrong number. I stated I did not have a sister. I pressed the red button ending the call permanently. The screen went completely dark. Evelyn handed me a sleek black folder. She stated we had one final piece of corporate business to attend to. She opened the folder, revealing a heavily redacted contract. Evelyn had leveraged my investment firm to quietly purchase the distressed debt on Jamal's commercial real estate portfolio. I did not just own the building my parents had burglarized. By the time the banks opened tomorrow morning, I would legally own every single piece of property Jamal and Brittany had ever falsely claimed as their own. The final checkmate was ready to be played. The heavy steel elevator doors slid completely shut. The moment the digital floor indicator began to drop, I pulled my phone from my pocket and ended the voice recording. I stood in my silent foyer and laughed aloud. Jamal was not just a coward, he was a complete and utter fool. He had just walked into the home of the woman his family had ruthlessly tormented for decades and offered a textbook, easily prosecutable quid pro quo bribery deal on tape. He actually believed his politician charm and a cheap promise to discard my sister would instantly erase 34 years of active abuse. I did not hesitate. I opened my encrypted messaging app and sent the high-definition audio file directly to Kendra. The federal prosecutor was working late. The read receipt appeared instantly. 2 minutes later, Kendra sent a single terrifyingly efficient text message back. She stated she was attaching the bribery evidence to his active extortion file and drafting an immediate, unsealable arrest warrant for federal public corruption. But I was not going to let the FBI have all the fun. Jamal still believed he was walking away with my money and his pride intact. He needed to be stripped of every single delusion before the steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. I called Evelyn at her home. I told her to expedite the commercial real estate debt seizure we had finalized the previous afternoon. I wanted Jamal locked out of his own campaign headquarters by sunrise. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I stood on the busy downtown sidewalk directly across the street from Jamal's massive multi-level campaign office. The building was prime real estate, a shining glass monument to his towering ego. Evelyn stood beside me, clutching a sleek leather briefcase containing the fully ratified foreclosure deeds. 2 massive moving trucks were already parked aggressively against the curb. Jamal arrived at 8:15 in a rented black sedan. He stepped out onto the pavement wearing a fresh, expensive suit, looking incredibly smug. He saw me standing near the entrance and immediately flashed a $1 million politician smile. He genuinely thought I was there to hand him a blank check. He strutted up to me confidently, adjusting his silk tie. He loudly proclaimed that he knew I would make the smart choice for my own future. He aggressively reached out to shake my hand, entirely ready to seal his corrupt bargain. I did not reach back. I simply looked at him with absolute disgust. Evelyn stepped smoothly between us. She did not hand him a check. She aggressively slapped a thick, legally binding notice of foreclosure directly onto his chest. Jamal fumbled instinctively, grabbing the heavy stack of papers before they hit the concrete. He looked down at the document, his arrogant smile instantly freezing into a mask of pure confusion. I demanded to know what this was. He frantically claimed his campaign headquarters lease was fully paid through November. Evelyn sharply corrected him. She stated his lease was utterly worthless because his holding company had defaulted on the primary commercial mortgage 3 weeks ago. She loudly explained that my private investment firm had purchased his distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. I was now the sole legal owner of the entire building, and I was officially evicting his campaign effective immediately. Jamal turned pale white. He looked wildly between Evelyn, the moving trucks, and me. He stammered, frantically begging me to stop the eviction. He aggressively reminded me of the deal we had supposedly struck the night before. He shouted that he promised to divorce Brittany and give me total control over lucrative city contracts if I just funded him. I smiled coldly. I told him he should never make illegal political promises in a state that only requires one-party consent to record a conversation. The color completely drained from Jamal's face. His jaw dropped. The horrific realization hit him that he had not manipulated me at all. He had actively handed me the exact weapon needed to destroy his entire life. He lunged forward, his politician facade entirely shattering into raw, violent panic. He screamed that I set him up and tried to grab my shoulders. My private security contractors stepped out from behind the moving trucks, instantly shoving Jamal backward onto the hard concrete sidewalk. He landed heavily on his back, his expensive suit tearing against the rough pavement. Before he could even attempt to get up, 3 dark, unmarked federal SUVs violently jumped the curb and surrounded him. The doors flew open simultaneously. Half a dozen heavily armed FBI agents swarmed the sidewalk. Kendra stepped out of the lead vehicle holding a fresh stack of federal warrants. She looked down at Jamal, who was currently scrambling backward like a cornered rat. Kendra loudly announced that he was under arrest for severe public corruption, attempted bribery of a private citizen, and violating the strict terms of his prior federal bail. Jamal started sobbing. The golden boy politician, the man my parents had practically worshipped as a god, broke down completely in the middle of the street. He violently thrashed against the agents as they hauled him to his feet and slammed him against the hood of an SUV. He screamed my name, begging me to tell them it was just a misunderstanding. He cried that his career was completely ruined and he would never survive a federal prison sentence. I watched the agents strip him of his expensive watch, his silk tie, and his remaining dignity. I did not feel an ounce of pity. He had built his entire miserable life by stepping on the throats of anyone he deemed beneath him, and I had simply kicked the ladder out from under his feet. I turned to Evelyn and instructed her to have the moving crew clear out every single piece of campaign furniture by noon and donate it all to a local women's shelter. We walked away from the chaotic scene without looking back. By sunset, the total destruction of my family was completely final. Brittany was sitting in a county jail cell without a dime to her name, desperately awaiting transfer to a federal holding facility. Jamal was facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary for wire fraud and public corruption. Thomas and Brenda were entirely homeless, completely bankrupt, and staring down their own massive criminal indictments while living out of a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The toxic parasitic empire they had built on my suffering was entirely eradicated. They had spent my entire youth taking everything from me. They had given my bedroom to my sister, stolen my peace, and demanded my absolute obedience. In return, I had quietly bought the ground beneath their feet and let them destroy themselves. I stood on the glass balcony of my penthouse, looking out over the glowing city skyline. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for 34 years was finally gone. I poured a glass of expensive champagne and raised it to the empty sky. The war was officially over, and I had won everything. The local news cycle became a 24-hour loop of my family's spectacular demise. I sat in my corner office at Apex Security Consulting, watching the muted television screens mounted on the wall. The morning anchors were enthusiastically breaking down the legal mechanics of Jamal's campaign finance fraud. Because my parents had illegally funneled their second mortgage funds through a shell corporation to bypass donation limits, the federal government had officially seized their suburban property under civil asset forfeiture laws. The bank foreclosure was instantly superseded by a federal padlock. My desk phone chimed. It was the downstairs security desk. The guard sounded extremely tense. He informed me that Thomas and Brenda were in the main lobby. They were refusing to leave, screaming my name and actively blocking the security turnstiles. They had brought 2 massive suitcases with them. I did not call the police immediately. I wanted to see this in person. I walked out of my office, taking the private glass elevator down to the ground floor. The moment the elevator doors opened, Brenda spotted me. She abandoned her heavy suitcase and practically sprinted across the polished granite floor. Her expensive clothes were severely wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and she looked like a woman who had not slept in days. Thomas was right behind her, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. Brenda grabbed the glass barrier of the turnstile, weeping hysterically. She screamed that federal agents had locked them out of their house at dawn. She cried that they had nowhere to go, all their credit cards were declining, and their wealthy country club friends were refusing to answer their calls. She begged me to let them move into my penthouse. She promised they would be quiet, that they would never bother me, and that we could finally be a real family again. Thomas slammed his fist against the glass, completely incapable of dropping his authoritarian facade even in the face of total ruin. He aggressively ordered me to stop playing games and buzz them through. He shouted that I was legally obligated to care for them in their old age, and that he would drag my company's name through the mud if I left them on the street. I stood on the secure side of the glass, crossing my arms over my tailored blazer. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I felt no anger, I felt no sadness. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute indifference. I smoothly pulled a thick legal envelope from my pocket and slid it through the narrow gap in the security glass. I told Thomas he might want to read the contents before he made any more aggressive threats. Thomas snatched the envelope quickly, tearing it open. He pulled out a stack of federal court transcripts. His eyes darted rapidly across the pages. The remaining color drained completely from his face. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. Brenda frantically asked him what it was. Thomas could barely speak. He choked on his words, staring at me with pure horror. I kindly explained it to her. I told Brenda that her golden child had officially signed a federal cooperation agreement at 3 o'clock this morning. To avoid serving hard time for destroying Jamal's office, and to secure immunity from the massive embezzlement charges, Brittany had traded the only currency she had left. She had given the federal prosecutors a fully documented timeline proving that Thomas and Brenda were the sole masterminds behind the illegal campaign mortgage scheme. Brittany testified that her parents had violently manipulated her into signing the wire transfers and managing the offshore accounts. Brenda let out a sound that I could only describe as a dying animal. She collapsed onto the granite floor, clutching her chest, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. The daughter she had worshipped, the woman she had sacrificed my childhood to protect, had just handed her a federal prison sentence on a silver platter. Thomas dropped the papers. They scattered across the lobby floor like dead leaves. He looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. He quietly asked me how I got those restricted transcripts. I smiled softly. I reminded him that I ran one of the most elite cybersecurity consulting firms in the country, and my lead corporate attorney practically ran the local district. I knew about Brittany's absolute betrayal before the ink on her plea deal was even dry. I looked down at Brenda, who was rocking back and forth on the cold floor. I told them they were not my family. I told them they were just two criminals who happened to share my DNA. I signaled to the head of my security detail. I instructed him to physically remove the trespassers from the building and to contact the local precinct to report them for targeted harassment. Thomas did not fight back. The arrogance that had fueled his entire miserable life was completely extinguished. He slowly reached down, helped his sobbing wife off the floor, and grabbed their suitcases. They walked out of the revolving glass doors, stepping out into the harsh glare of the midday sun, entirely broken and completely alone. 2 weeks later, the final legal hammer fell. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse wearing a sharp navy suit and a pair of dark sunglasses. The courtroom was packed to the brim with local journalists, political commentators, and curious onlookers hungry for the end of the scandal. Jamal was brought in through the side door wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands heavily cuffed in front of him. He looked directly at the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with the gallery. A few minutes later, Thomas and Brenda were escorted in by federal marshals. They looked 10 years older, physically diminished by the crushing weight of their actions and their daughter's ultimate betrayal. And finally, Brittany was called to the stand. She wore a cheap gray suit provided by her court-appointed public defender. She looked at Jamal with pure hatred, and she refused to even acknowledge our parents sitting at the defense table. For 4 grueling hours, I watched my sister methodically destroy the rest of my family under oath. She detailed every single illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent document signature, and every corrupt conversation they had ever held in their pristine suburban kitchen. She burned them all to the ground, hoping to save herself. When the federal judge finally handed down the sentences, the absolute silence in the courtroom was deafening. Jamal received 12 years in a federal penitentiary for public corruption, witness tampering, and widespread extortion. Thomas and Brenda were sentenced to 5 years each for their active roles in the campaign finance conspiracy. Brittany, despite her extensive cooperation, did not walk away clean. The judge sternly noted her extensive history of financial manipulation and her violent public outbursts. He sentenced her to 3 years in a minimum security facility, permanently revoking her passport and legally freezing any remaining hidden assets she thought she had saved. I stood up before the bailiffs even began to clear the room. I walked out of the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Evelyn confirming that the final transfer of Jamal's commercial properties into my holding company was fully complete. I was now the sole legal owner of the very real estate empire he had used to terrorize the district. I took a deep breath. The city around me felt entirely different. The invisible chains of toxic loyalty, the constant psychological gaslighting, and the suffocating weight of my childhood were permanently destroyed. I had not just survived my family's relentless cruelty. I had outplayed them, dismantled their power, and reclaimed my absolute freedom. I hailed a cab, giving the driver the address to my favorite high-end restaurant. It was time to celebrate. The obedient scapegoat they had created was dead, and the woman who took her place was completely unstoppable. The heavy wooden doors clicked firmly shut behind me, sealing my parents in a prison of their own making. I walked down the marble corridor, the sharp clack of my heels echoing against the stone walls. As I pushed through the main courthouse exit, a blinding wall of camera flashes and shouting reporters immediately swarmed the steps. They had been waiting for the final verdict on the massive campaign finance scandal. A dozen microphones were shoved in my direction, aggressively demanding a statement about my parents' sentencing and my sister's spectacular downfall. I did not flinch. I did not hide my face. I stopped at the top of the stone steps perfectly framed by the grand pillars of the courthouse. I raised a single hand, signaling for absolute silence. The chaotic shouting died down instantly. I looked directly into the central camera lens. I stated clearly and confidently that justice had been served today. I explained that corruption, whether in local politics or behind closed family doors, eventually meets the harsh, unforgiving light of the law. I publicly thanked the federal prosecutor's office for their tireless dedication to uncovering the truth. When a reporter aggressively asked if I felt any remorse for my family's total financial ruin, I offered a cold, practiced smile. I replied that I only felt profound relief that the city was finally safe from their predatory extortion schemes. I then announced that my cybersecurity firm, Apex Consulting, would be donating a substantial portion of our yearly profits to local organizations dedicated to helping women escape financial abuse. It was the perfect killing blow. In under 2 minutes, I had completely controlled the narrative, boosted my company's public image, and permanently cemented my family's legacy as nothing more than a pathetic cautionary tale of greed. Evelyn and her massive security team guided me smoothly through the remaining press scrum and into the back of my waiting town car. The moment the heavy doors closed, shielding us from the flashing cameras, Evelyn handed me a thick leather-bound dossier. She informed me that the judge's restitution order had already been processed through the federal banking system. Because my parents owed me hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and punitive damages, the court had authorized a direct permanent garnishment on whatever meager wages they might earn in the future. They were legally required to spend the next 5 years working minimum wage jobs just to pay me back for the privilege of trying to destroy my life. But Evelyn had one final surprise. She turned the page of the dossier, revealing a certified property deed, following the federal seizure of my parents' suburban home. The property had been quietly placed into a government asset forfeiture auction this morning. Evelyn smiled her terrifying predatory smile and informed me that my private holding company had placed the winning bid in cash. The transaction was fully complete. I did not just own the luxury high-rise they had tried to break into. I now officially owned the very house where I had spent my miserable childhood. I instructed the driver to change our destination immediately. 30 minutes later, the town car pulled up to the familiar manicured driveway of the suburban fortress. The neighborhood was completely silent. The massive front doors were sealed with heavy federal evidence tape, but Evelyn had already secured the legal keys from the local sheriff. I walked up the brick pathway, cut the tape with a pocket knife, and pushed the front door open. The house was completely empty. The professional movers and federal agents had stripped it down to the bare floorboards. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing loudly in the hollow space. I walked up the sweeping wooden staircase and went directly down the hall to my old bedroom. I stood in the doorway. This was the exact room they had violently taken away from me when I was a teenager. This was the space they had gladly handed to Brittany, demanding I go live in the streets if I did not like their abusive rules. They had stripped me of my comfort, my dignity, and my sense of safety, all to appease a golden child who eventually robbed them completely blind. I ran my hand along the empty door frame. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming, undeniable sense of absolute victory. They had told me I would end up completely homeless and worthless. Instead, I had weaponized my pain, built a multi-million-dollar corporate empire, and literally bought the ground beneath their feet. My phone vibrated sharply in my blazer pocket. It was an email notification from a generic, unlisted address. I opened it. It was a message from Brittany. She was using her monitored computer time in the minimum security federal facility to send me a desperate, groveling essay. She blamed our parents for everything, falsely claiming they had manipulated her fragile mental state. She begged me to put money on her commissary account and pleaded for me to hire a high-priced appellate lawyer to fight her sentence. She promised to be the perfect, loving sister the moment she got out. I did not even bother reading the final paragraph. I hit the block button, permanently routing any future correspondence from that facility directly into an encrypted spam folder. She was a ghost to me now, too. I walked back downstairs and stepped out onto the front porch, locking the heavy door firmly behind me. I turned to Evelyn and gave her my final set of instructions regarding the property. I told her to hire a demolition crew for the following Monday. We were going to bulldoze the entire house, clear the lot completely, and sell the prime real estate to a commercial strip mall developer. I wanted absolutely no trace of my parents' toxic legacy left standing in this city. I climbed back into the luxurious comfort of the town car. The continuous cycle of generational trauma and family abuse was completely broken. I had burned their entire dynamic to the ground and built a masterpiece over the ruins. I looked out the tinted window as the neighborhood faded away into the distance forever. For the first time in 34 years, my chest felt completely light. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was the sole architect of my own freedom, and my beautifully unbothered life was finally entirely mine. My phone vibrated against the cool glass of the balcony railing. It was Evelyn. She never called outside of business hours unless someone was about to make a catastrophic legal mistake. I answered, taking a slow sip of my champagne, watching the city lights begin to flicker on far below. Evelyn sounded highly amused. She informed me that a notoriously sleazy daytime television network had just faxed a frantic request for comment to our legal department. Brittany had apparently managed to secure a guest spot on their upcoming afternoon broadcast. She was planning a tearful, exclusive television interview to claim I had manipulated the FBI, falsified digital financial evidence, and illegally stolen her rightful inheritance. She was desperate for the $10,000 appearance fee to cover her mounting credit card debt and avoid eviction. I laughed softly into the phone. The sheer blinding arrogance was astounding. Even while working a cash register and living in a tiny studio, my sister genuinely believed she could still control the public narrative and cast herself as the ultimate victim. I told Evelyn to draft a standard cease and desist order, but I explicitly stated I wanted to deliver it in person. The next morning, Evelyn and I walked into the bustling television studio located in the downtown entertainment district. I wore a pristine white tailored suit, radiating absolute control. We bypassed the frantic production assistants, ignored the protests of the floor managers, and walked straight into the VIP green room. Brittany was sitting in a cheap plastic makeup chair. She was wearing a faded off-the-rack dress that hung loosely on her shrinking frame. The heavy studio makeup could not hide the deep dark circles under her eyes, or the bitter harsh lines that retail work and poverty had permanently carved into her once perfect face. When she saw me in the mirror, she physically jumped. She spun around, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and immediate defensive rage. She aggressively demanded to know how I got past the building security. She shrieked at the makeup artist to call the producers and have me thrown out immediately, claiming I was stalking her. The head producer rushed into the room looking incredibly flustered. He puffed out his chest and loudly told Evelyn and me that we were trespassing on a closed set and needed to leave before he called the police. Evelyn did not even blink. She smoothly handed a pristine manila folder directly to the producer. She calmly explained that her firm represented Apex Consulting and my personal estate. She informed the producer that his star guest was actively on federal probation for felony wire fraud and gross embezzlement. Evelyn then pointed a manicured finger at a specific highlighted clause in Brittany's federal plea agreement. As a strict condition of her reduced sentence and probation, Brittany was legally barred from profiting off her crimes or publicly contradicting her sworn federal testimony. Evelyn smiled her terrifying predatory corporate smile. She told the producer that if he put Brittany on national television to claim she was framed, he would not just face a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit from my company. He would be actively broadcasting a federal probation violation live on air, forcing the DOJ to subpoena his entire network. The producer turned completely pale. He looked down at the heavily indexed legal documents and then looked at Brittany with absolute disgust. He realized instantly that his sensationalized afternoon segment was actually a massive legal landmine that could cost him his entire career and bankrupt his department. He threw the folder onto the makeup counter. He ordered the makeup artist to stop working immediately. He looked directly at Brittany and shouted that the segment was permanently canceled. He aggressively demanded she get off his set before he called studio security to physically drag her out into the alley. Brittany completely panicked. She grabbed the producer's arm, begging him not to cancel the interview. She cried that she desperately needed the appearance fee to avoid eviction this month. The producer shoved her hand away loudly, calling her a massive liability, and stormed out of the green room without looking back. The silence that followed was deafening. Brittany stood in the center of the brightly lit room, her chest heaving, her hands trembling violently. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, entirely ruining the heavy television makeup. The fierce, entitled golden child was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman who had finally run out of victims to exploit. She whispered my name, her voice cracking painfully. She begged me for a loan. She claimed she had not eaten a hot meal in 3 days, and her landlord was threatening to change the locks on Monday morning. She swore she would pay me back every single penny if I just gave her $5,000 to survive the month. I looked at her without a single ounce of pity. I remembered the exact day I turned 18 when she stood in the hallway of our parents' massive suburban house and laughed as they handed her the keys to my bedroom. I remembered her looking down at me, telling me I was a worthless burden and that I should go live in the streets. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white blazer. I looked her dead in the eyes and repeated the exact words she had said to me all those years ago. I told her that sounded like a personal problem. I turned my back on her for the absolute final time. I walked out of the green room, leaving her sobbing hysterically into her hands, completely alone in her self-made destruction. 5 months later, the holiday season arrived. For 34 years, Thanksgiving had been a mandatory sentence of psychological torture. It was a day filled with Brenda's aggressive culinary criticism, Thomas's drunken demeaning lectures, and Brittany's endless arrogant gloating. But this year, the sprawling formal dining room of my penthouse was filled with genuine warmth and radiant joy. I hosted a massive dinner for my chosen family. Evelyn sat at the head of the long oak table, pouring expensive wine and telling ruthless, hilarious courtroom stories. Kendra, the federal prosecutor, sat across from her, laughing loudly and trading sharp legal banter. My lead software engineers, my loyal personal security team, and the professional mentors who had actually supported my business were all gathered around the table, passing heavy platters of incredible food. There was no tension. There was no walking on eggshells. There was only loud, joyous laughter echoing off the high ceilings and the cheerful clinking of crystal glasses. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow began to gently fall over the glowing city skyline, blanketing the streets in a quiet, peaceful white. I stood up at the end of the table holding a glass of sparkling cider. The room instantly quieted down, everyone turning to look at me with genuine respect and deep affection. I raised my glass. I did not make a long dramatic speech about the past. I did not mention the people who were currently eating frozen dinners in subsidized housing or cramped freezing studio apartments. They did not deserve a single second of my time or a single word of my breath. I simply looked around at the brilliant, fiercely loyal people who filled my home with brilliant light. I smiled, feeling a profound, unbreakable peace radiating through my entire chest. I proposed a simple toast to the families we consciously choose to build and the magnificent empires we build for ourselves. The room erupted in enthusiastic cheers. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, ringing sound signaling the official beginning of the rest of my beautiful life. The dark, heavy story of my past was finally and permanently closed, and the blank pages of my bright future were mine alone to write. It tasted exactly like victory. I lowered the crystal flute and turned my attention to the vibrant energy pulsing across the rooftop. Evelyn caught my eye from across the terrace. She was deep in conversation with a prominent state senator, but she raised her glass in a silent, deeply respectful salute. Kendra walked over, adjusting the collar of her sharp-tailored tuxedo jacket. She clinked her glass against mine, the crystal ringing clearly over the smooth jazz playing in the background. She informed me the federal prosecutor's office had officially closed the books on the entire campaign finance network that very morning. There were no loose ends. There were no hidden appeals. The destruction of their corrupt empire was absolute, documented, and entirely permanent. I thanked her, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of lightness expanding in my chest. For 34 years, my body had been trapped in a constant, agonizing state of fight or flight. I was always bracing for the next insult, the next aggressive demand for money, the next blatant display of favoritism toward Brittany. Now my nervous system was entirely quiet. The silence was beautifully deafening. The elegant jazz band transitioned into a smooth, upbeat tempo. Just as I was about to grab a passing hors d'oeuvre, a man in a highly expensive, flashy suit approached me. It was Richard Vance Sr., the managing partner of the disgraced law firm that had originally tried to sue me on behalf of my parents. He was definitely not on the guest list. He had slipped past the ground floor concierge by tailgating a local politician. He stood far too close, projecting an aura of unearned, desperate authority. He smugly congratulated me on my recent hostile takeovers, his voice dripping with condescension. He then boldly offered to buy Apex Holdings for a fraction of its actual market worth, aggressively claiming a young, emotional woman like me was bound to mismanage such a massive commercial real estate portfolio. He suggested I take his lowball buyout and retire quietly before the ruthless corporate market crushed me. He actually believed his gray hair, his expensive watch, and his aggressive posture intimidated me. He thought I was still a scared girl who could be easily bullied by loud, demanding men. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. I told him his security clearance was entirely revoked. I casually signaled my lead security contractor, a massive former Marine standing near the elevator banks. Before the guard even took a single step, I leaned in and spoke directly into Richard's ear. I informed him that my cybersecurity division had spent the last 3 weeks conducting a comprehensive digital audit of his law firm's offshore escrow accounts. I clearly recited a very specific, highly illegal Cayman Islands routing number. The arrogant, patronizing smirk vanished from his face instantly. I told him he had exactly 60 seconds to exit my building voluntarily, or I would personally hand that specific routing number to the federal prosecutor standing less than 10 feet away. Richard turned the color of wet ash. He did not say a single word. He turned on his expensive leather heel and sprinted toward the exit, practically shoving a waiter out of his way to reach the descending elevator. Kendra walked back over, watching him flee in sheer panic. She asked what I said to him. I simply smiled and replied that I was just taking out the remaining trash. The rest of the evening proceeded flawlessly. The autumn air was crisp, and the city below looked like a sprawling, endless ocean of gold and silver light. At exactly 9 o'clock, Evelyn motioned for the jazz band to pause. She stood by the main bar, tapping a silver spoon against her champagne glass. The crowd quieted immediately, turning their attention to the front of the terrace. Evelyn announced that we were not just celebrating the massive financial success of Apex Security Consulting today. We were celebrating a profound structural shift in the city's real estate landscape. She pulled a large, heavy leather-bound folio from her briefcase and placed it squarely on a cocktail table. She invited me to step forward. I walked to the center of the terrace, the cool night breeze catching the edge of my silk dress. I opened the folio. Inside was the finalized master deed for the massive commercial high-rise I had ruthlessly ripped away from Jamal during his public downfall. I picked up a heavy gold pen. I looked out at the faces of my chosen family. I announced that effective immediately, the building would no longer serve as a monument to political corruption and fragile male ego. I was officially transferring the entire commercial property into a newly formed, heavily funded nonprofit trust. The building was being completely repurposed into a comprehensive resource center and secure housing facility for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. It would provide top-tier legal representation, career retraining, and impenetrable physical security for victims who had been financially trapped by toxic families and abusive partners. I signed my name aggressively across the bottom line, permanently sealing the transfer. The rooftop erupted into deafening applause. Kendra wiped a genuine tear from her eye. The very empire my family had tried to use to destroy me was now legally bound to protect women exactly like me. The party raged on long into the night, filled with unapologetic laughter and the fierce, undeniable energy of total liberation. Long after the last guest had taken the private elevator down to the lobby, I stayed behind on the terrace. The catering crew had cleared the tables, leaving the rooftop perfectly pristine. I stood alone at the glass railing, looking down at the quiet, empty streets. I thought about the scared, exhausted young woman I used to be. I thought about the cold nights I spent crying in a cramped, freezing apartment while my parents bought my sister designer clothes with my stolen college fund. That girl was gone. She had been forged in a furnace of absolute betrayal and emerged as a weapon made of solid titanium. I took a deep breath of the freezing electric air. I did not need a family. I did not need their conditional love, their toxic approval, or their hollow manipulative apologies. I had built my own fortress, and I held every single key. The sky began to lighten in the east, signaling the dawn of a completely new day. My life was finally entirely and fiercely my own, and it was absolutely magnificent. The ultimate lesson from Alyssa's journey is that you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. True power comes not from seeking validation from toxic family members, but from walking away and building your own empire. Blood does not dictate loyalty, and you owe nothing to people who only view you as a resource to exploit. Your success is your best revenge, and your peace is your ultimate prize. If this story resonated with you, hit the subscribe button, share your own survival stories in the comments below, and join our community of strong women taking back power.